Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. It was a quiet Tuesday night, just me and the hum of the engine as I drove around, waiting for my next ride request. I liked working the late shifts. The roads were quieter, and the tips were usually better when people were coming back from late nights out. That night had been slow, though, and I was thinking about calling it quits when a request popped up. A pickup just a few blocks away. The profile didn't have a picture, just the name Tom, and the destination was across town. I accepted the ride and made my way over. The street was poorly lit, and as I pulled up to the curb, I saw someone step out of the shadows. He was a tall man, wearing a dark hoodie with the hood pulled up. He had his hands in his pockets, and his movements were slow, almost deliberate. Something about him made me uneasy, but I told myself I was being paranoid. He opened the back door and slid in without a word. The car filled with the faint smell of cigarettes. I glanced at him in the rearview mirror. He had the hood pulled low, and I couldn't make out much of his face except his mouth, which was set in a tight line. "Evening," I said, trying to break the silence. "Yeah," he mumbled, barely audible. I cleared my throat and started driving. The GPS directed me toward an area I didn't know well. Suburbs that were mostly new developments, still half-built in some parts. The roads were empty, and the streetlights were spaced far apart. It felt isolated. As I drove, I noticed he was shifting around in the back seat, almost fidgeting. I tried to ignore it, but it was hard not to notice. Every time I glanced in the mirror, he was staring out the window, but there was something about the way he sat rigid, like he was coiled up and ready to spring. "You heading home?" I asked, just to fill the silence. "No," he said. That was it. No explanation. The air felt heavier after that. I focused on the road, but my hands were gripping the wheel tighter than usual. A few minutes later, I heard the sound of fabric rustling, and I looked in the mirror again. He had taken something out of his pocket. It was small, hard to see in the dim light, but he was holding it tightly in his hand. I swallowed hard and kept driving. My mind was racing, but I didn't want to overreact. People fidgeted with things all the time. Keys, phones, whatever. It didn't mean anything. But the way he held it, it felt deliberate. We were getting closer to the destination now, but something didn't feel right. The GPS said we were headed to a dead-end street, surrounded by construction sites. I glanced back at him again, and this time, he was staring straight at me. His hood had slipped back a bit, and I could see his eyes. They were cold, calculating, like he was sizing me up. "Are you sure this is the right address?" I asked, my voice steady even though my heart was pounding. He didn't answer right away. Then he leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. "Just keep driving," he said, his voice low and flat. I felt a chill run down my spine. Something was very wrong. My instincts were screaming at me to get out of this situation, but I didn't know how. We were in the middle of nowhere, and there wasn't another car or person in sight. I decided to take a chance. I slowed the car down, pretending to check the GPS. "It looks like the app's glitching," I said. "Mind if I pull over for a second to fix it?" He didn't say anything, but his grip tightened on whatever he was holding. "Don't stop," he said, his tone sharp now. My pulse was racing. I glanced at the gas gauge and realized I was getting low. I needed to think fast. I spotted a gas station up ahead, its neon sign flickering in the distance. I'm almost out of gas, I said, trying to sound calm. I'll just stop here real quick. No, he said firmly. Keep going. I ignored him and pulled into the gas station anyway. The place was deserted, but it was well lit, and I figured it was my best shot at getting help. I parked near the pump and turned off the engine. Stay in the car, he said, leaning forward now. I could feel the tension radiating off him. I nodded but didn't make any move to get out. Instead, I reached for my phone, pretending to check something. My hands were shaking, and I accidentally dropped it between the seats. I cursed under my breath and reached down to grab it, using the moment to think. I'll be quick, I said, opening the door and stepping out before he could say anything else. As soon as I was outside, I walked toward the gas station's entrance, hoping someone might be inside. The door was locked, and the lights were off. My heart sank. I turned back to the car, and that's when I saw him step out. He was holding a knife, the blade catching the light from the gas pump. I froze, my mind racing. He started walking toward me, slow and deliberate, like he had all the time in the world. I backed away, keeping my eyes on him. Get back in the car, he said, his voice calm but menacing. I didn't respond. Instead, I bolted toward the back of the station, hoping to put some distance between us. My chest was tight, and my legs felt like they were moving through water. I could hear his footsteps behind me, steady and unhurried. I rounded the corner and spotted a payphone attached to the side of the building. I grabbed it and dialed 911, my hands trembling so badly I could barely press the buttons. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's voice crackled through the receiver. There's a man, he's trying to kill me, I gasped, glancing over my shoulder. He was still coming, the knife glinting in his hand. Stay on the line, the operator said. Officers are on their way. I dropped the phone and kept running. I didn't know where I was going, but I needed to stay ahead of him. I heard the sound of tires screeching in the distance, and I prayed it was the police. A minute later, I saw the flashing lights. The man turned and started running the other way, but the officers were faster. They tackled him to the ground, the knife clattering to the pavement. I collapsed against the wall, shaking and trying to catch my breath. The police asked me questions, but I could barely answer. All I could think about was how close I'd come to not making it out. They told me later that he had a record, mostly for theft and assault. I didn't care about the details. I was just glad it was over. That night changed the way I looked at people, at my job, at everything. I didn't drive nights after that. I couldn't. It started because one of the tenants complained about a smell. I manage a handful of properties, and this one was a small single-story house I'd been renting out for years. Nothing fancy, but it was in a quiet neighborhood, and the tenants never gave me much trouble. The current renters, a young couple, had been there for about 6 months. They called one afternoon and said they'd been noticing a strange smell in the house, like something damp and rotten. I figured it might be a plumbing issue or maybe something had gotten into the walls, mice or a raccoon. That kind of thing isn't uncommon in older homes. I told them I'd swing by the next day to take a look. When I got there, they greeted me at the door, looking a bit uneasy. They said the smell was stronger in the back bedroom, so I went straight there. As soon as I stepped inside, I could tell they weren't exaggerating. The air felt heavy, like it had soaked in whatever was causing the smell. It wasn't just damp, it was sour, like old food left out too long. I started looking around. Checked under the bed, in the closet, behind the furniture. Nothing obvious. Then I noticed a faint draft near the baseboard along one wall. The air was colder than it should have been. That's when I remembered the crawl space. This house didn't have a basement, just a narrow crawl space running under the floors. I asked the tenants if they'd noticed anything odd, like animals scratching or anything like that. They said no, but they looked nervous now, standing in the doorway. I told them I'd check it out and went outside to find the access panel. The panel was in the backyard, near the foundation. It was old, painted the same dull gray as the house, and stuck tight. I had to use a crowbar to pry it open. When I finally got it loose, the smell hit me like a punch to the face. It was worse than inside, thicker, more rotten. I hesitated. I didn't want to crawl into whatever was causing that stench, but I couldn't just leave it. I grabbed a flashlight from my truck and crouched down, shining the beam inside. The crawl space was low, just a few feet high, with exposed pipes and insulation hanging in places. At first, all I saw was dirt and cobwebs. Then my light caught something that shouldn't have been there. It was a pile of blankets, shoved into one corner like a makeshift bed. Next to it was a small stack of empty food wrappers and cans. My stomach tightened. Someone had been living down here. I backed out quickly, heart racing. I looked around the yard, half expecting to see someone watching me, but it was empty. I went back inside and told the tenants what I'd found. They looked horrified. I asked if they'd ever heard noises at night or seen anything strange. They shook their heads, but they were pale, like they were starting to connect dots they hadn't noticed before. I called the police. While we waited for them to arrive, I couldn't stop thinking about how someone could have been living down there for so long without anyone noticing. The food wrappers looked old, like they'd been collecting for years. But the blankets didn't. They looked relatively clean, like someone had been using them recently. The officers showed up about 20 minutes later. I showed them the crawl space, and one of them climbed inside with a brighter light. He came back out after a few minutes, holding something small in his hand. It was a wallet. Inside were a few crumpled bills, an ID, and a handful of receipts. The ID belonged to a man I didn't recognize. The address on it was from out of state. The officer asked if I knew him or if he was a former tenant. I told them no, but the name nagged at me. It felt familiar, though I couldn't place it. The officers decided to search the crawl space more thoroughly. They brought out more blankets, an old camping lantern, and a backpack filled with clothes and toiletries. Whoever had been living down there had made themselves comfortable. But they didn't find the person, which made me even more uneasy. After the police left, I went back home, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That night, I dug through old rental records, trying to figure out why the name on the ID felt familiar. And then I found it. The man had applied to rent the house years ago, before the previous tenants moved in. I turned him down because of a poor credit check. I sat there staring at his name, chills running down my spine. Had he been living under the house all this time? I thought about the tenants before this couple, an older man who kept to himself. He'd never mentioned anything about smells or noises. Maybe he hadn't noticed, or maybe he had but didn't want to deal with it. The next day, I went back to the house. The tenants had decided to stay with family until everything was resolved, so the place was empty. I walked through every room, checking every closet, every corner. I don't know what I was expecting to find, but the house felt different. Like it wasn't just a house anymore. It felt like it had been invaded, tainted by someone who wasn't supposed to be there. I checked the crawl space again, this time with a stronger flashlight. The police had cleared out most of the belongings, but the smell still lingered. I crawled further in, following the narrow space until I reached the back wall. That's when I saw it. A small hole had been cut into the wood, just big enough for someone to squeeze through. On the other side was a hidden compartment, barely large enough to sit up in. Inside was a mattress, stained and sagging, and more trash, old newspapers, empty bottles, and something that made my stomach turn, a small pile of photos. They were photos of the tenants. The couple, the older man before them, even a few of me taken from outside. Some were recent, others looked years old. Whoever had been living here had been watching us all along. I backed out of the crawl space, heart pounding. I called the police again and showed them what I'd found. They took the photos as evidence and promised to investigate further. That was the last I heard about it. They never found the man, and I ended up selling the house a few months later. I couldn't keep managing it, knowing what had happened there. To this day, I double-check every crawl space, every attic, every corner of the properties I manage. I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, living in someone else's shadow, watching. I decided to go hiking on my own that weekend. I'd done it plenty of times before, so it didn't seem like a big deal. I'd picked a trail that wasn't too remote but still far enough from the city to feel quiet. It was a warm day, and I wanted to clear my head. The trail looped through a forest, winding uphill for a few miles before curving back down. I figured I'd be out for 3 hours, maybe 4. I parked at the trailhead just after noon. There were only 2 other cars in the lot, which didn't seem unusual. I liked the quiet anyway. I grabbed my pack, double-checked my water and snacks, and headed up the path. The first mile was uneventful, just trees and the sound of birds. The air was fresh, and the trail was dry, easy to follow. I saw the first person around the second mile. He was coming downhill, dressed in a faded blue hoodie and cargo pants. His face was partially shadowed by his hood, but I noticed he was tall and lean, moving with an awkward sort of stiffness. When we passed each other, I nodded and said hello, like you do on the trail. He didn't respond, just glanced at me with this strange, blank expression. I shrugged it off. Not everyone is friendly, and it wasn't the first time I'd come across someone like that. After he disappeared around the bend, I forgot about him and kept going. The trail grew steeper as I climbed, and the trees got denser. I stopped for water around the halfway point, leaning against a boulder to catch my breath. That's when I noticed it, the faint sound of footsteps behind me. At first, I thought it was just someone else coming up the trail. I glanced back, but the path was empty. I told myself it was probably the echo of my own steps or maybe an animal. Still, it made me uneasy. I capped my bottle and started walking again, picking up my pace a little. The sound of footsteps faded, and I convinced myself I'd imagined it. I reached the top of the loop an hour later. The view was beautiful, stretching out over the valley below. I took a few photos and sat down to eat a granola bar. That's when I saw him again, the guy in the blue hoodie. He was standing at the edge of the clearing, maybe 50 feet away, half hidden by the trees. My stomach dropped. He wasn't hiking. He wasn't walking. He was just standing there, facing me. It felt wrong, like he was waiting for something. I tried to play it cool, telling myself he was probably just taking a break. I packed up my things and started back down the trail, keeping an eye on him. He didn't move. The downhill stretch should have been easier, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every so often, I hear a twig snap or leaves rustle behind me. I'd turn around, but no one was there. My heart was racing now, and I found myself walking faster than usual, almost jogging. The sun was starting to dip lower, and the shadows between the trees grew longer. About a mile from the trailhead, I stopped to catch my breath. That's when I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, coming down the trail. I whipped around, and there he was, less than 20 feet away, the same blank expression on his face. He wasn't pretending anymore. He was following me. I shouted at him, "What do you want? Why are you following me?" My voice came out louder than I expected, echoing through the trees. He didn't answer, just tilted his head slightly, like he was trying to figure something out. Then he started walking toward me. Panic took over. I turned and ran, my pack bouncing against my shoulders. The trail was narrow and uneven, and I nearly tripped more than once. My legs burned, but I didn't stop. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps heavier, faster now. He wasn't trying to hide it anymore. I rounded a bend and saw a side trail, barely visible through the undergrowth. Without thinking, I dove into it, hoping to lose him. The path was overgrown, branches scratching at my arms and face. I ducked behind a large tree, trying to catch my breath as quietly as possible. My ears were straining for any sound, but all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. Then I heard him again, closer this time. He was walking slowly, his footsteps crunching on the leaves. I pressed myself against a tree, barely daring to breathe. He passed within 10 feet of me, his head turning side to side like he was looking for something or someone. My chest felt like it was going to explode, but I stayed frozen until his footsteps faded. When I was sure he was gone, I crept back to the main trail, staying low and moving as quietly as I could. My legs were shaking, and my hands felt numb. I knew I had to get back to my car, but the trailhead felt impossibly far away. I made it another half-mile before I saw him again. He was standing in the middle of the trail, facing me. I don't know how he got ahead of me. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. I looked around for something, anything I could use as a weapon. My eyes landed on a thick branch lying near the trail. I grabbed it and held it in front of me like a bat. "Stay back," I shouted. My voice cracked, but I didn't care. He didn't move at first, just stood there, watching me. Then he took a step forward, and something snapped in me. I swung the branch as hard as I could, catching him in the side. He stumbled, but his expression didn't change. It was like he didn't feel pain. I swung again, this time aiming for his head. He ducked and lunged at me, knocking me to the ground. The branch flew out of my hands, and I scrambled to get away, kicking and clawing. His grip was strong, and I could feel his fingers digging into my arm. Somehow, I managed to grab a rock from the ground and smashed it against his temple. He let out a grunt and fell back, giving me just enough time to get to my feet. I didn't look back. I ran as fast as I could, the trail blurring around me. When I finally reached the parking lot, it was empty. My car was the only one left. I jumped in, locked the doors, and started the engine with shaking hands. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The trailhead was empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still there, watching. The building was nearly empty when I stepped into the elevator. I'd stayed late at work again, finishing up reports that couldn't wait. The office lights were dimmed for the night, and the air felt colder than it should have. I pressed the button for the ground floor and leaned against the wall, staring at the numbers as they started to tick down. Around the 5th floor, the elevator jolted hard enough to make me stumble. It shuddered for a second and then stopped, the lights flickering once before steadying. I hit the button for the ground floor again, but nothing happened. I pressed the emergency button, but there was no sound, no response. Just silence. I took a deep breath and told myself it was fine. Elevators get stuck sometimes. I had my phone, and I'd call for help. I reached into my bag and pulled it out, but there was no signal. I waited around, trying to find a bar, but it was useless. I was trapped. Then I heard a voice. "Hello?" It was a man's voice, muffled and coming from above. I looked up and saw a shadow through the small grate on the elevator ceiling. "Are you stuck in there?" he asked. "Yes," I said, my voice shaking. The elevator stopped. "The buttons aren't working." "Don't worry," he said. "I'm the repairman." I was already working on another issue in the building. "Let me see if I can get you out of there." Relief washed over me for a moment, but then something didn't sit right. It was too late for anyone to be working on the elevators. And I hadn't seen any maintenance equipment or signs when I came in that morning. "Okay," I said cautiously. "Do you need me to do anything?" "No," he said. "Just stay calm. I'll get you out soon." I waited, listening to the sound of metal scraping above me. My unease grew with every second. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I called out again. "What's your name?" There was a pause, just long enough to make my stomach twist. "John," he said. "I work for the maintenance company." The name felt generic, rehearsed. "Do you have an ID or something? Can you show me through the grate?" There was another pause, longer this time. "Look, lady," he said, his tone sharper now. "Do you want me to get you out or not?" I didn't respond. My hand tightened around my phone, even though it was useless. The air in the elevator felt heavier, like it was closing in around me. I glanced at the emergency button again, pressing it over and over, but there was still no response. The scraping above me stopped, and I heard a thud. My eyes shot up to the grate. The shadow was gone. "John?" I called out. There was no answer. Suddenly, the emergency hatch on the ceiling rattled. My heart jumped into my throat as I saw fingers curl around the edge. The hatch creaked as it started to open, and a face appeared, dirty, unshaven, and definitely not wearing anything that looked like a uniform. "Almost got it," he said, smiling in a way that made my skin crawl. "What are you doing?" I demanded, backing into the corner. "I need to get in there to reset the system," he said. "It's the only way to fix it." "No!" I shouted. "Stay out." His smile faded, replaced by something colder. "I'm trying to help you," he said. "Why are you making this harder?" I said, "Stay out." I screamed, grabbing my bag and holding it in front of me like a shield. He ignored me, pushing the hatch open further. His head and shoulders were through now, and he was lowering himself into the elevator. I swung my bag at him, hitting his arm. He flinched but kept coming. "Stop!" I yelled, swinging again. This time, I hit him in the face, and he lost his grip. He fell back with a loud thud, and I heard him cursing. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped my bag. I could hear him moving above me, muttering under his breath. Then the elevator jolted again, and the lights flickered. For a second, I thought it was going to start moving, but it stayed still. "I tried to be nice," he said, his voice low and angry now. "You shouldn't have done that." The hatch slammed shut, and I heard him climbing down the side of the elevator shaft. My mind raced. He was coming for me. I didn't know how, but he was. I grabbed my phone again, praying for a signal, but there was nothing. I started pressing all the buttons on the panel, hoping one of them would do something. The elevator jerked suddenly, and the lights went out completely. I was plunged into darkness, the only sound my own ragged breathing. Then I heard it, the sound of the elevator doors being pried open from the outside. "Leave me alone!" I screamed, my voice echoing in the confined space. The doors opened just a crack, and I saw his face peering through. His eyes were wide and wild, and his mouth twisted into a grin. "There's nowhere to go," he said. I scrambled back, pressing myself against the far wall. My hand brushed against something cold and metal, the emergency fire extinguisher. I grabbed it, holding it tightly. The doors opened wider, and he started to climb in. I didn't think. I swung the extinguisher as hard as I could, hitting him square in the head. He let out a grunt and fell back, but I didn't stop. I hit him again and again until he stopped moving. The elevator doors slid shut, trapping me inside with the silence. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath. A few minutes later, the elevator jolted again, and the lights came back on. The car started moving, descending slowly until it reached the ground floor. When the doors opened, a security guard was standing there, his eyes widening when he saw me. "Are you okay?" he asked. I nodded, too shaken to speak. He helped me out of the elevator, and I saw a maintenance worker running toward us. They found the man in the elevator shaft later. He wasn't dead, just unconscious. He wasn't a repairman. He didn't even work in the building. No one knew how he got in. I never rode that elevator again. It wasn't supposed to be anything serious. Just a dumb prank. Jason had been hyping it up all week, saying how we needed to do something big before summer ended. He kept talking about how epic it would be, sneaking into Matt's house and scaring him while he was gaming. Matt's parents were out of town, and he'd been bragging all day about having the house to himself. It felt harmless. Stupid, sure, but harmless. The plan was simple. Wait until dark, go through the back door. Jason swore Matt never locked it, and jump out at him. Matt would freak out, we'd laugh about it, and that'd be the end of it. But everything went wrong from the start. We got there just after 10. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy, like it's pressing down on you. Jason led the way, his flashlight bouncing as we cut through the side yard. Sarah and I followed, trying not to step on anything that would make noise. The back door was there, just like Jason said, slightly ajar. "See? Told you," Jason whispered, grinning. He pushed the door open, and we slipped inside. The house was dark, except for a faint glow coming from upstairs. It matched what we expected. Matt's room was upstairs, and he was probably playing something on his computer. Jason motioned for us to be quiet as we moved through the kitchen. It smelled weird, like something burnt, but I didn't think much of it at the time. Houses have smells, right? The stairs creaked as we went up, each sound making my heart pound harder. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The layout didn't look like I remembered. I'd only been to Matt's house a couple of times, but I was pretty sure his living room wasn't this small, and the furniture wasn't so old. Still, I didn't say anything. I figured it was just my nerves messing with me. We reached the top of the stairs, and Jason pointed toward the door with the light leaking out from underneath. He mouthed, "That's him," and gave us a thumbs up. I didn't feel like giving one back. Jason crept forward, his hand on the doorknob. He counted down silently, 3, 2, 1, and then threw the door open, yelling at the top of his lungs. But the room wasn't what we expected. It wasn't a bedroom. It was a small office, cluttered with papers and old furniture. A desk lamp cast a dim light over the mess. There was no computer, no mat, nothing that made sense. "What the hell?" Jason said, his voice breaking the silence. That's when we heard a low, steady creak coming from downstairs. Like someone shifting their weight on the floorboards. Sarah grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "We need to leave," she whispered. Jason didn't argue. He backed out of the room, and we started down the hallway, moving as quickly and quietly as we could. The creaking stopped, but the air felt heavier now, like something was waiting. When we got to the stairs, we froze. A man was standing at the bottom, his face hidden in shadow. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and holding something in his hand, a bat or a pipe. I couldn't tell. "What are you doing in my house?" he said. His voice was low, even, but there was something in it that made my stomach drop. Jason raised his hands. "Sorry, man. We thought this was someone else's place. It's a mistake." The man didn't move. "You think breaking into someone's home is funny?" "No, sir," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "We're leaving now. We're really sorry." The man stepped forward, and the light from the hallway caught his face. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and his mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You're not going anywhere," he said. Jason lunged for the stairs, but the man moved faster than I thought possible. He swung the bat, catching Jason in the ribs. Jason crumpled, gasping for air, and the sound of it sent a wave of panic through me. Sarah screamed, grabbing my arm and pulling me back down the hallway. We ran, but we didn't know where to go. The house was a maze of unfamiliar rooms, each one darker than the last. I could hear the man's heavy footsteps behind us, slow and deliberate, like he knew we had nowhere to hide. We ducked into a bedroom and slammed the door. Sarah locked it, her hands shaking so badly she could barely turn the knob. Jason was somewhere up there, and I couldn't stop thinking about the way he'd fallen, the sound of the bat hitting him. "We need to find a window," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Sarah nodded, and we started looking. The curtains were thick, blocking out any light, but I found one and yanked it open. The window was there, but it was nailed shut. "Shit," I muttered, trying to pry it open. The doorknob rattled behind us. Sarah backed away, her hands covering her mouth to stifle a sob. "I know you're in there," the man said, his voice muffled through the door. "You think you can just walk into my house and leave?" I grabbed a lamp from the nightstand, holding it like a weapon. Sarah grabbed a chair, though I wasn't sure either of us had the strength to use them. The door shook as the man rammed into it. The lock held the first time, but I knew it wouldn't last. "Please," Sarah whimpered. "Please, just leave us alone." The man didn't answer. He rammed the door again, and the wood splintered. In that moment, I don't know what came over me. Maybe it was adrenaline, or maybe it was just pure fear, but I ran toward the window and slammed the lamp against the glass. It shattered, and cool night air rushed in. "Go!" I yelled, grabbing Sarah and pushing her toward the opening. She climbed out, cutting her hands on the broken glass, but she didn't stop. I followed, ignoring the pain as I scrambled onto the roof. The man burst into the room just as I slid through the window. He reached for me, his fingers brushing my ankle, but I kicked out and caught him in the face. He stumbled back, cursing. Sarah and I climbed down the side of the house, our hands raw from the brick. When we hit the ground, we ran. We didn't stop until we were halfway down the street, panting and bleeding but alive. We found Jason outside, leaning against a car and holding his side. He was pale, but he managed a weak smile when he saw us. We didn't call the police. We didn't tell anyone. We just got in the car and drove, leaving the house and the man behind. But I still see his face in my nightmares, and I can still hear his voice, low and calm, promising we wouldn't leave. I had been searching for a job for months by then. It was getting to the point where I was willing to take anything just to stop the endless cycle of applications, rejections, or worse, no response at all. When I got the email inviting me for an interview, I jumped at it. The company was called Clearview Enterprises. I didn't remember applying, but I had sent out so many resumes it wasn't surprising. The email was short, with an address and a time. It didn't even list a position title, but I convinced myself that was normal. I was desperate. The address was for an office building on the edge of town, far from the main business district. It wasn't exactly remote, but it wasn't busy either. The kind of area where you might find warehouses or small businesses that no one really notices. When I pulled into the parking lot, there were only a couple of cars, and no signs on the building except for the address number. The door was unlocked, and inside was a small lobby with beige walls and old carpet. Our receptionist desk sat empty, with no nameplate or papers on it. There was no sound except for a faint hum, maybe from the overhead lights. It felt like I had walked into a place that wasn't fully alive. I almost turned around and left right there, but I told myself to stop being paranoid. The economy was bad. Maybe they downsized. A man stepped out from a hallway as I was looking around. He was tall, in his 40s maybe, with a clean-shaven face and short hair. He wore a plain button-up shirt and slacks, nothing that screamed interviewer but not totally casual either. He smiled and held out a hand. "You must be here for the interview," he said. His voice was steady, almost too steady, like he had practiced every word in advance. I shook his hand and nodded. "Yes, thank you for having me." "Of course. Right this way." He led me down the hallway. It was narrow, with doors on either side, all of them closed. The carpet was the same as the lobby, and the walls were the same beige. It felt endless, like we were walking deeper into a place that didn't want us there. Finally, he stopped at a door on the left and opened it, gesturing for me to enter. The room was small, just a desk and 2 chairs. No decorations, no windows, no company logo. The desk was empty except for a notebook and a pen. The air felt heavy, like it hadn't been touched by fresh air in years. He motioned for me to sit, and I did. He sat across from me, opening the notebook but not writing anything. "So," he said, smiling again, "tell me about yourself." I launched into the usual spiel about my background, my previous jobs, and why I was interested in the role, though I still didn't know what the role was. He nodded along, but something about his expression didn't sit right. He wasn't listening, not really. His eyes stayed locked on mine the entire time, unblinking, like he was watching something other than me. "What is the position, exactly?" I asked after a while, hoping to shift the focus. He tilted his head, as if the question confused him. "We'll get to that. First, I want to understand you better. What motivates you?" The question was generic, but the way he asked it wasn't. His tone was too smooth, too rehearsed, like he asked it 100 times and still didn't care about the answer. I answered anyway, stumbling through something about personal growth and challenges. He didn't react, just stared. My chest felt tight, and I realized the room was warmer than it had been. The air was stale, almost suffocating. "Do you live alone?" he asked suddenly. The question hit me like a slap. It was out of nowhere and completely inappropriate. I froze for a second, then forced a laugh. Why does that matter? He didn't laugh. His smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. Just trying to get a sense of your situation. It's important to know who we're working with. I didn't answer. My palms were sweating now, and I started to feel lightheaded. Something about this wasn't right. I glanced at the door, calculating how quickly I could get to it if I needed to. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. Are you nervous? You seem nervous. No, I'm fine, I lied, my voice shaking. Good, he said, sitting back again. That's good. The silence stretched between us, thick and unbearable. He tapped the pen on the notebook, not writing, just tapping. The sound was maddening. I think I should go, I said finally, standing up. He didn't move, just watched me. Why the rush? We're not done. I don't think this is the right fit, I said, edging toward the door. He stood then, faster than I expected. He was blocking the door before I could reach it. His smile was gone, replaced by something darker, something colder. Sit down, he said, his voice flat. No, I said, trying to sound firm but failing. I'm leaving. He didn't move, didn't even blink. You're not going anywhere. My heart was racing now, every instinct screaming at me to run, but he was too close. I turned back toward the desk, looking for anything I could use. The chair was too heavy, but the pen, I grabbed it and turned back to him, holding it like a weapon. Move, I said, my voice breaking. He laughed, low and quiet, like I had just told a joke. You're not going to hurt me. I lunged anyway, aiming for his shoulder, and the pen sank into his shirt. He yelled, staggering back, and I bolted past him, throwing the door open. The hallway felt endless as I ran, the air growing thicker with every step. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps heavy and relentless. The lobby came into view, and I sprinted for the door, slamming into it and bursting outside. The cool night air hit me like a wave, but I didn't stop. I ran to my car, fumbling with the keys as I glanced over my shoulder. He was standing in the doorway, watching me. His shirt was stained with blood, but he didn't seem to care. He didn't follow me, just stood there, smiling that same empty smile. I got in the car, locked the doors, and sped out of the parking lot. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep the wheel steady. When I looked in the rearview mirror, the building was dark again, as if no one had ever been there. I didn't report it. I didn't even tell anyone. I just went home, locked every door and window, and sat in the corner of my living room, shaking until the sun came up. I was driving back home late one evening after visiting my brother in the next state over. The highway had turned into a smaller road, and then that road had thinned out to just a two-lane stretch cutting through miles of nothing. Trees lined both sides, their dark shapes pressing in, and the only light came from my headlights carving a path in front of me. The sky was pitch black, no moon, no stars, just an endless void. I saw the car about a mile ahead, just sitting there on the shoulder with its hazard lights blinking. It was an older sedan, blue or black, I couldn't tell. There weren't any other cars around, not for miles. At first, I thought it was abandoned, but as I got closer, I saw a figure standing beside it, waving. I slowed down, my hand hovering over the high beam switch, debating whether to stop. Something about it didn't feel right. I told myself it was just the late hour, the isolation messing with my head. People broke down all the time. Maybe they didn't have cell service out here. I pulled over a few yards in front of the car and rolled down the passenger side window. Everything okay? I called out. The man jogged up to my car. He looked to be in his late 30s or early 40s, with messy hair and a scruffy beard. He wore a jacket that seemed too thin for the chill in the air, and his hands were shoved deep into his pockets. His face was pale, shiny with sweat despite the cold. Yeah, he said, his voice shaky. Car won't start. Think the battery's dead. Do you have jumper cables? I kept my engine running, my hand still gripping the wheel. I think so. Let me check. I got out and went to the trunk, popping it open while keeping an eye on him. He didn't come closer, just stood there by the front of his car, shifting his weight like he couldn't stand still. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something was off about him, but I couldn't figure out what. I found the cables and held them up. Got him. His face lit up, but it wasn't relief, it was something else, something that made my stomach turn. Thanks. Just pull up closer so we can hook it up. I hesitated. Pop your head first. He didn't move. His hands stayed buried in his pockets, and his eyes darted toward the trees for just a split second. It was quick, but I caught it. My pulse quickened. Sure, yeah, I'll do that, he said, but instead of going to his car, he started walking toward me. Stay back, I said, stepping to the side of my car. I held up the cables like they were a weapon, even though I knew they wouldn't do much good. He froze, his smile fading. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the only sound the ticking of his hazards and the distant hum of my engine. Then I heard a rustling in the trees behind me. I whipped around, but I didn't see anything, just darkness. When I turned back, he was grinning again, whiter this time, his teeth catching the faint light from my headlights. You really shouldn't have stopped, he said. Before I could respond, a second man emerged from the woods. He was bigger, stocky, wearing a hooded sweatshirt pulled tight around his face. He moved fast, too fast, heading straight for me. I dropped the cables and bolted for my driver's side door. The first man lunged, grabbing at my jacket, but I twisted away, slamming into the side of my car. My keys were still in the ignition, the door still open. I dove in, slamming the door behind me as the stocky guy reached the car. The first man pounded on the window, yelling something I couldn't make out over the roar of my own heartbeat. The stocky one yanked at the handle, but I had locked it. I threw the car into drive and stomped on the gas. The tires screeched as I pulled back onto the road. In the rearview mirror, I saw both men standing there, one of them shouting and kicking at the ground. Then the sedan's trunk popped open, and I saw movement, a third man climbing out. My stomach dropped. They had planned this, waited for someone like me to come along. I could barely keep the car straight as I sped down the road, my hands shaking on the wheel. I glanced in the mirror again and saw headlights. The sedan wasn't dead after all. They were chasing me. I floored it, the engine whining in protest as the car surged forward. The road twisted and turned, and I prayed I wouldn't miss a curve and end up in a ditch. The headlights behind me were getting closer, brighter. They weren't just following, they were gaining on me. Up ahead, I saw a turnoff, a narrow dirt path leading into the woods. I didn't think, just yanked the wheel and turned onto it. The tires skidded on the loose gravel, but I managed to keep control, the car bouncing over ruts and rocks. I killed the lights, plunging into darkness. I pulled over and cut the engine, my breath coming in gasps. The only sound was the ticking of the cooling engine and the blood rushing in my ears. I waited, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles ached. The sound of an engine approached, growing louder. Their car sped past the turnoff, the taillights disappearing down the road. I stayed where I was, too scared to move, too scared to even breathe. Minutes passed, then what felt like hours. When I finally felt safe enough to start the car again, I drove back to the main road, keeping my headlights off until I was certain they were gone. I didn't stop again until I reached the nearest town, pulling into a brightly lit gas station. I sat there for a long time, shaking, trying to process what had happened. I thought about calling the police but didn't even know where to begin. I didn't have a plate number, just vague descriptions of the men in their car. What would I even say? I never found out who they were or what they wanted. All I know is that I didn't go back to help anyone after that, no matter how stranded they looked. I work at a clothing store in one of those smaller, outdated malls. You know the type: faded carpets, flickering lights, and barely anyone walking around except for the same few regulars. Most of the stores had shut down years ago, but a handful of places were still clinging on. I'd been at the job for a while, mostly closing shifts because I was one of the younger workers. I didn't mind it too much. The evenings were quiet, and I liked being able to take my time with cleaning up. This happened a few weeks ago. I was scheduled to close on a Friday night. Normally, I'd be out by 9:30, but that night the manager had asked me to finish up some extra tasks, stocking shelves in the back and vacuuming the carpet near the fitting rooms. By the time I finished, it was almost 10:15. The mall had been closed for a while, and the other stores were dark. I could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights, but that was it. Everything else was silent. I locked up the front of the store and started walking toward the employee exit at the back of the mall. It's a long hallway with scuffed up tiles and cracked walls, lined with storage doors for the different stores. At night, the place feels like a maze. The overhead lights are dimmer in that part of the building, and every footstep echoes. I'd walked that hallway dozens of times before, but that night, it felt different. I couldn't put my finger on why. Halfway down the hall, I heard a noise behind me. It sounded like something scraping against the tile floor. I stopped and turned, expecting to see one of the cleaning crew pushing their cart. There was nothing there. The hallway stretched back in the direction I'd come, empty. I brushed it off. Old buildings make weird noises, and the mall was definitely old. I kept walking, but now my ears were tuned in, listening for anything out of place. My footsteps echoed louder than usual, or maybe I was just paying more attention to them. When I reached the exit, I went to push the door, but it didn't budge. The maintenance guy had told me before that the lock sometimes jammed if it wasn't lined up right, so I leaned into it harder. Still nothing. That's when I noticed the heavy metal bar across the door. It wasn't locked, exactly, but someone had pushed the emergency bar down and wedged a piece of broken wood into the mechanism. It wasn't like that earlier in the day. I was sure of it. I felt a tightness in my chest. My first thought was to call mall security, but my phone was still in my bag back in the store. I cursed under my breath and turned back down the hallway. The other exits were farther away, but there was one closer to the food court. If I could get there, I could call someone. The hallway seemed longer on the way back, the dim lights casting weird shadows on the floor. I heard the scraping sound again, this time ahead of me, near one of the storage doors. My heart was pounding, but I kept walking, trying to keep calm. It wasn't until I passed the second door on my left that I saw it move just a little, like someone pulling it shut. I froze. Every instinct told me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I stared at the door, my breathing shallow, waiting for something else to happen. A few seconds passed, then a minute. Nothing. I forced myself to keep walking, picking up the pace as I moved past the door. My shoes squeaked on the tile, the sound too loud in the silence. I didn't look back. I couldn't. My whole body was stiff, like I was trying to hold myself together with sheer willpower. When I got back to the store, I unlocked the gate and slipped inside, pulling it down behind me. The space felt safer, even with the dim lighting and the mannequins casting creepy shapes against the walls. I grabbed my bag from behind the counter and fumbled for my phone. My hands were shaking so bad it took me 3 tries to unlock it. No signal. I stared at the screen, willing the bars to appear. Nothing. The mall must have been too deep in the building for a connection. My stomach dropped. I thought about trying to use the store phone, but it only connected to other phones in the mall system, and I didn't even know the number for security. The scraping sound came again, this time from outside the gate. It was louder, closer. My breath caught in my throat. I backed up, gripping my phone like it was a weapon, even though I knew it wasn't. I moved behind the counter, crouching low, trying to keep out of sight. I heard footsteps now, slow and deliberate, moving past the gate. Whoever it was didn't speak, didn't make any sound other than their shoes against the tile. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't come inside. They paused near the entrance, the shadow of their feet visible under the gate. I clutched my phone tighter, my pulse hammering in my ears. Then they moved on, the footsteps fading down the hallway. I didn't dare move until I was sure they were gone. When I finally stood, my legs were shaky, and my whole body felt weak. I peeked out from behind the counter, scanning the area. The hallway was empty again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I knew I couldn't stay there all night. If they came back, I'd be trapped. I decided to make a run for the food court exit, hoping it hadn't been tampered with like the first one. I slipped out of the gate as quietly as I could, keeping my steps light. Every noise felt amplified in the stillness. The food court was at the far end of the hallway, past the storage doors and a few other shops. As I approached, I saw the faint glow of the exit sign above the door. Relief washed over me. Then I saw the figure. They were standing in front of the exit, their back to me. It was the same person I'd seen earlier, the one who had been outside the storage door. They were tall and broad-shouldered, wearing dark clothes that blended into the shadows. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I stepped back, but my shoe scuffed the tile. The figure turned. I didn't wait to see their face. I bolted, my feet pounding against the floor as I ran back the way I'd come. I heard them behind me, their footsteps heavier, faster. They were chasing me. I ducked into one of the side hallways, my eyes darting around for a hiding spot. I spotted a janitor's closet and yanked the door open, slipping inside and shutting it behind me. My chest heaved as I tried to quiet my breathing, pressing my back against the shelves. The footsteps slowed, then stopped outside the door. I could see the shadow of their feet under the gap. My heart felt like it was going to explode. I clutched my phone, trying to will a signal to appear. After what felt like an eternity, the shadow moved on. I waited until I couldn't hear the footsteps anymore, then slipped out of the closet and made a break for the food court exit. This time, I didn't stop. I barreled through the door, feeling the cold night air hit my face. I didn't stop running until I reached my car in the empty parking lot. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the keys in the ignition. I didn't look back. I drove straight to the police station and told them everything. They checked the mall but didn't find anyone. The only evidence was the broken window jammed into the emergency exit door. I quit my job the next day. I haven't been back since. The drive was long, and I'd been on the road for hours. By the time I pulled into the parking lot of the hotel, my eyes were heavy, and my neck was stiff. It was one of those smaller places, 2 stories with beige walls and a neon sign flickering in the corner of the lot. There weren't many cars, and the lobby lights looked dim, but I didn't care. I just needed a bed for the night. Inside, the desk clerk was a middle-aged guy with glasses and a tired look. He handed me a key card without much small talk, just told me my room number 112, first floor, at the end of the hallway. I was grateful for that. I didn't want to lug my suitcase up any stairs. The hallway smelled faintly of bleach and stale carpet. A couple of lights buzzed overhead, but most of them worked fine. The numbers on the doors were peeling a little, but it was clean enough. My room was at the far end, right by the exit door leading to the parking lot. When I slid the key card in, the lock clicked and the handle turned. I pushed the door open, dragging my suitcase behind me. That's when I noticed it. The light was already on. It wasn't bright, just a lamp by the bed casting a warm yellow glow across the room. For a second, I thought maybe housekeeping had left it on by accident. I stepped in further, letting the door swing shut behind me. Then I saw the bag. It was sitting on the chair in the corner, a small duffel bag, the kind you take for an overnight trip. Next to it, on the table, was a half-empty water bottle and a pack of gum. My chest tightened. Someone was already in here. I froze, my hand still on the handle of my suitcase. The room was silent except for the hum of the air conditioner. I scanned the space quickly. The bed was unmade, the blankets pulled back on one side. The bathroom door was half open, and I couldn't see inside from where I stood. I thought about backing out, going straight to the front desk to tell them they'd given me the wrong room, but something stopped me. What if whoever was in here was still inside? What if they were in the bathroom right now? My heart was pounding, but I couldn't move. I stood there, listening for any sound of breathing, shuffling, anything, but the room was quiet. I took a step back, trying to be as quiet as possible, and reached for the door handle. Just as my fingers touched it, I heard the faintest noise. It wasn't loud, just the soft creak of something shifting. It came from the bathroom. I stared at the half-open door, my breath caught in my throat. The light in the bathroom was off, but there was just enough glow from the bedside lamp to cast shadows on the tiled floor. One of those shadows moved. Panic hit me hard. I yanked the door open, my suitcase forgotten behind me, and stumbled back into the hallway. I didn't look back. I just ran straight to the front desk. The clerk looked up, startled, when I burst in. I must have looked insane, out of breath and wide-eyed, but I didn't care. "There's someone in my room," I said, my voice shaking. The clerk frowned. "That's not possible," he said. "You're the only guest in 112. I insisted. "There's a bag," and the light was on. "Someone's in there." He grabbed a key from under the counter and motioned for me to follow him. I didn't want to go back, but I also didn't want to stay in the lobby alone. So I followed him, my hands shaking as we walked down the hallway together. When we got to the door, the clerk knocked. "Hotel staff," he called out. No answer. He knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. He glanced at me, then slid his master key into the lock and pushed the door open. The room was dark now. The lamp by the bed was off, and the duffel bag was gone. The bed was still unmade, and the water bottle and gum were missing too. The clerk stepped inside, flipping the bathroom light on. It was empty. "I swear," I stammered. It was all there, the bag, the light. Someone was in here. The clerk gave me a skeptical look but didn't argue. "Maybe housekeeping left the light on and forgot to finish making the bed," he said. "I'll get you another room." He left me standing there while he went back to the front desk to grab a new key. I didn't want to be in that hallway alone, so I followed him, my stomach churning. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone step out of one of the other rooms. The new room was on the second floor, and the clerk walked me there himself. He opened the door, turned on the light, and waited while I checked inside. This one was clean, empty, no signs of anyone else. He handed me the key and left. I locked the door behind him and slid the chain across the latch. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I checked the closet, the bathroom, even under the bed. Nothing. I tried to settle in, but every little sound made me jump. I left the TV on for noise, but it didn't help much. Around midnight, I finally turned the lights off and got into bed, though I didn't expect to sleep. I must have drifted off at some point because I woke up to a sound. It was faint, just a soft click, like a door unlocking. My eyes snapped open, and my heart started racing. I stayed completely still, straining to hear. Then I heard it again, the soft creak of the door. Someone was in my room. I didn't move. I kept my breathing shallow, pretending to be asleep. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. The footsteps were light, careful, moving closer to the bed. I wanted to scream, to jump up and fight, but I was frozen. The footsteps stopped right next to me, and I could feel the presence of someone standing there. I kept my eyes shut, hoping they'd think I was asleep and leave. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved away. I heard the door click shut again. I stayed in bed, too terrified to move, until the first light of dawn crept through the curtains. When I finally got up, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely pack my things. The chain on the door was still latched, but I knew what I'd heard. Someone had been inside. I didn't bother checking out at the desk. I just left the key on the counter and drove away as fast as I could. I don't know who it was or what they wanted, but I haven't stayed in a hotel since. I had been looking for a used couch for weeks, and when I saw a Craigslist ad for one being given away for free, I thought it was my lucky day. The ad was simple: free couch, you haul it. First come, first served. No pictures, but I wasn't picky. It was the kind of thing I could throw a blanket over and make it work in my living room. I didn't expect much, just something to get me by until I could afford a nicer one. I messaged the poster, and the reply came back within a few minutes. The man, whose name was Craig, said the couch was in good condition and that I could come pick it up any time after work. He seemed friendly enough, and there were no red flags. I was eager to get the couch and figured I would just load it into my truck and be on my way. The address he gave was in an older part of town, on a quiet street that wasn't far from where I lived. I didn't think much of it. The house was a bit run down, the kind of place you'd expect someone who was giving away furniture to live in. The lawn was overgrown with weeds, and the paint on the house was chipped, but there were no cars parked out front, which seemed odd. I rang the doorbell, and a man opened the door after a moment. He looked a little older than I expected, maybe in his mid-50s, with messy hair and a scruffy beard. He wore a faded t-shirt and sweatpants. Not the most put-together guy, but that wasn't unusual for someone giving away free furniture. "Hey, you here for the couch?" he asked, his voice rough but not unfriendly. "Yeah, that's me," I said, giving him a small wave. "I'm here to pick it up." Great, Craig said, stepping aside to let me in. "It's in the living room. Just follow me." I walked past him and into the house. It was a little darker inside than I had expected, the only light coming from a small window in the living room. The place smelled like old wood and stale air, but again, nothing too alarming. The couch was against the far wall, just like in the picture he'd sent me. As I looked at the couch, Craig started talking. "I wasn't sure anyone would want it," he said, his voice almost to himself. "You know, It's just been sitting there for a while. But it's a good couch. Real sturdy. I nodded, not really knowing what to say. The couch looked fine, though I could tell it had been used. There were some stains on the fabric, but nothing that would stop me from taking it. I'll just go grab my truck, I said, turning to head back to the door. Craig didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped in front of me, blocking my path. He wasn't tall, but he was stocky, and he had an odd look on his face, like he was thinking about something. "Hey, you mind if I ask you something?" he said, his voice suddenly quieter, almost nervous. "Ah, sure. What's up?" I replied, starting to feel a little uncomfortable. "You live around here?" he asked, his eyes studying me closely. "Yeah, just down the street," I said. "Not far." Craig muttered, looking away for a second. "You got a good job." I blinked. Yeah, I work at a local warehouse." "Why?" "Just curious," he said, giving me a strange smile. It didn't quite reach his eyes. "You're not like all the others, are you? You know, the ones who just want to take and never give?" I didn't know what he meant by that, and I didn't want to stick around to find out. Something about him was off. "Listen, I'll just grab the couch and get going, all right?" I started to move again, but Craig stepped forward, blocking me again. This time, his posture was more forceful, like he was trying to make sure I couldn't leave. "You in a hurry?" he asked, his tone turning more demanding. "I think we should talk. We should sit down, you know? Talk about things." I felt a knot in my stomach. Something was definitely wrong. I wasn't sure if he was high or just mentally unstable, but either way, I didn't want to be there anymore. "No, really, I've got to go," I said, backing up toward the door. Craig's eyes narrowed. "You think I'm just going to let you leave with the couch? You think I'm some kind of idiot?" I froze. My heart skipped a beat. His voice had changed, sharper, angrier. This wasn't the same person who'd answered the door. What?" I stammered. Craig stepped closer to me, his expression hardening. "You think you're just going to take something from me and leave? Like I'm some charity case?" He took a step forward, and I instinctively took a step back, my body tensing in response. "I'm not taking anything, man," I said, trying to stay calm. "I just came for the couch. You said it was free." Craig laughed, but there was nothing funny about it. "You think I don't know what's going on? You think I don't know what people like you are really after?" I didn't know what he meant, but the look in his eyes made me nervous. "I don't know what you're talking about, all right? I don't want any trouble. Just let me leave." Craig was standing right in front of me now, his face inches from mine. I could feel his breath on my face, and I could smell alcohol on his breath. He reached for my arm, his fingers digging into my skin, and I instinctively jerked away, panic starting to rise. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his voice low and almost a growl. "I didn't invite you in here for nothing. You're going to stay and talk to me." I backed up, my hands reaching for the door handle, but Craig was quicker. He slammed the door shut and locked it. The click echoed in my head, and my stomach twisted with fear. "Now," he said, his eyes wild, "we talk. Or else you don't leave." I was desperate now. I wasn't sure what he was capable of, but I knew I couldn't stay there with him. I had to think fast. I looked around the room for anything I could use as a weapon. My phone was in my pocket, but there was no way I could call for help without him noticing. In that moment, I made a snap decision. I rushed toward the back door, hoping it wasn't locked. When I reached it, my hand fumbled for the handle, and by some miracle, it was open. Without thinking, I bolted outside, running as fast as I could toward my truck. I didn't dare look back to see if he was following me. I jumped in my truck, slammed the door, and locked it. My hands were shaking as I started the engine and sped off down the street, the house disappearing in my rearview mirror. I never went back to that house. I didn't even think about picking up anything else off Craigslist after that. I don't know what Craig's intentions were, but I'm pretty sure I got out just in time. I'd been cycling for hours when I came across the dirt path that led deeper into the woods. It wasn't marked on any of the maps, but I was feeling adventurous. The weather had been perfect for a long ride, sunny but not too hot, the kind of day you don't waste. I'd been exploring the area for a while now, having taken some smaller, winding trails, and each one seemed to lead me further away from civilization. It was a peaceful ride, the kind where you forget about time and just enjoy the surroundings. I didn't think much of it when the trail started to narrow. The trees were getting thicker, and the air felt cooler. It wasn't unusual, but as the path curved around a bend, I saw something up ahead that made me stop. There were 3 people standing in the clearing. At first, I thought they were just a group of hikers or campers, maybe resting for a bit. But as I got closer, I realized they weren't just standing around. They were digging. The ground was uneven, and they were working hard, their shovels sinking into the dirt as they pulled out clumps of soil. They weren't talking. They weren't looking up at me either. It was like they didn't even notice I was there, or maybe they didn't care. I slowed down, my heart starting to pound in my chest. Something about it didn't sit right with me, but I couldn't figure out why. My instincts were telling me to turn around and leave, but curiosity got the better of me. I told myself they were probably just burying a pet or something, nothing to worry about. I was almost past them when I heard one of them speak, their voice low but clear. "Get the rope." The words made me stop. I wasn't sure why, but the tone in his voice set off a warning bell in my head. My eyes flicked to the ground, and that's when I saw it. A shape under the dirt. It wasn't an animal. It was too big for that. My pulse quickened, and my throat tightened. I started to backpedal, but before I could turn around completely, I heard a rustling behind me. I wasn't alone anymore. One of them, a tall man with a scruffy beard, had stepped out from the trees, blocking my path. He looked calm, too calm, and his expression was unreadable. He was holding something in his hand, something heavy, and my stomach dropped when I realized it was a large, thick rope. "You lost?" he asked, his voice casual, but there was a sharpness to it. I didn't know what to say. My mouth went dry, and I could feel my legs start to shake. There was no way I was going to ride past them now. I was too far out in the woods, and they were too close. I could already feel the knot of panic rising in my chest. I started, trying to come up with some excuse, anything that would make them let me go, but I couldn't form a sentence. "I'm just..." The man stepped forward, cutting me off. "You don't need to be here," he said, still calm, but there was an edge to his words now. "You should turn around and go back the way you came." My brain was screaming at me to move, to run, but I couldn't. I was frozen. My eyes darted to the other 2. They hadn't stopped digging, but I could hear their footsteps behind me. There was no way out. The clearing was too small, and my bike was too far to reach in time. "We've got to finish this," the man with the rope said. "It'll be quick, don't worry." I knew then what they were doing, and I understood the horror of it. They weren't burying a pet. They weren't burying anything that belonged to them. It was a body. It had to be. I didn't know who it was, but it didn't matter. My chest felt tight, and I struggled to breathe. I knew that I was in danger. I had to get out. Without thinking, I turned sharply and pushed my bike into the thick brush on the side of the path. I didn't look back. I just pedaled hard, the wheels spinning as fast as I could make them go, crashing through the underbrush. I could hear the sound of footsteps behind me running, chasing, but I couldn't stop. My heart was pounding in my ears, and the world around me seemed to blur as I tore through the woods. I knew I couldn't keep this up forever. They were faster than me, and I could feel my legs burning. I had to find somewhere to hide, somewhere to lose them, but the trees were closing in around me. The path was getting more difficult to navigate. Rocks and branches kept getting in the way, and I nearly lost control of the bike a couple of times. I heard one of them shout, but I didn't dare look back. I didn't even slow down. I just kept riding. The trees ahead opened up, and I saw a small creek. I knew the water could slow them down, so I veered off the path, making a sharp turn toward the bank. I wasn't thinking clearly. My mind was clouded with fear, but I hoped the creek would give me the few seconds I needed to get away. The moment I hit the water, I lost my balance. The bike slid out from under me, and I crashed into the muddy bank. My hands hit the cold water, and I scrambled to get back on my feet. I could hear them now, not far behind. I had no time to get my bike up. I just ran, stumbling over the rocks and into the woods again. I didn't know how long I ran. The trees seemed endless, the path impossible to find. I just kept moving, my legs shaking, my breath ragged. It felt like hours, but eventually, I saw a break in the trees. A road. It was distant, but I could see it in the distance, just beyond a stretch of open field. My lungs were burning, and my body was heavy with exhaustion, but I pushed forward. I knew that if I could just make it to the road, I might have a chance. Maybe someone would be there, maybe a car would drive by. I reached the field, my heart pounding in my chest, and saw the road just up ahead. But then, I heard it again. The footsteps. Close. Too close. I didn't dare look back. I ran, and I ran as fast as my legs would carry me, the sound of pursuit right behind me. I burst onto the road, my heart thudding in my ears, and there, just ahead, was a car coming. I flagged it down, waving my arms wildly, and the driver stopped. A middle-aged man with a confused look on his face. I didn't say anything, just jumped in the moment the door opened. The man didn't question me, just slammed the door shut and sped off. I didn't look back. I didn't speak a word the entire ride, too terrified to do anything but breathe and try to process what had just happened. The man dropped me off at the nearest town, and I didn't stick around to thank him. I don't know who they were or what they wanted, but I'm never going back to that part of the woods again. I never thought much about personal trainers before. I'd always been someone who liked to work out on my own, but after a few months of feeling like I wasn't getting anywhere, I decided to give it a shot. The gym I went to wasn't huge, just a small local spot, but it had a good reputation, so I signed up for a few sessions with one of their trainers, Matt. He seemed nice at first. Just your average guy in his late 20s, a little too chatty for my taste but harmless enough. I was mostly focused on getting stronger, so I didn't pay much attention to the details. He'd send me a few texts between sessions, nothing weird, just reminders about my next workout or diet tips. I didn't think anything of it. He seemed professional, and I was just trying to get my body in shape. But over time, things started to feel off. It started with the compliments. At first, they were small, you know. You're really improving. You're looking great. Stuff like that. But after a while, they started getting more personal. Your legs look amazing in those shorts. You've got this great body. It's going to look even better when you keep pushing like this. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe he was just trying to keep me motivated. But then, it started feeling like he was looking at me a little too much. I noticed how he'd keep glancing at me when I do certain exercises. It wasn't a quick look. He'd stare, and when I'd catch him doing it, he'd just smile and go back to the workout. But it was that smile that stuck with me. It wasn't a friendly smile. It felt forced. I decided to talk to one of the other trainers, just to vent a little. I wasn't sure if I was overreacting, but I didn't feel comfortable anymore. She said Matt was fine, that he was a good guy, that he'd been working there for a while and had great reviews. She mentioned that sometimes trainers got overly focused on their clients' progress, that maybe he just wanted to see me succeed. I didn't feel reassured, but I let it go. Then the texts started coming more frequently. Not just about workouts, but personal messages. What are you up to today? You should come by the gym after hours sometime. We could work out one-on-one, no distractions. It felt strange. It felt like he was trying to take the training outside of the gym, and I didn't like that. I'd been ignoring most of his messages, but one evening, when I saw a text that read, "I was just thinking about you. We should hang out sometime, outside the gym," I couldn't ignore it anymore. My stomach sank. I replied with a simple, "I'm not really looking to hang out outside of training, Matt." That should have been enough, but it wasn't. The next day at the gym, he was acting different. He was overly friendly, trying to engage in small talk even while I was in the middle of my routine. I was focused on my set, but he wouldn't stop. "You look great today. That shirt really shows off your arms." I didn't know how to respond. I just nodded and kept working. After that day, I noticed he started positioning himself closer to me while I worked out. He'd stand beside me while I was lifting weights, sometimes standing so close I could feel his breath. It wasn't natural. He wasn't offering advice, he was just standing there, watching. The worst part was when I finish a set, and he'd say something like, "You're so strong." I could feel it from here. "You really push yourself, don't you?" It started to get under my skin. I'd purposely try to avoid eye contact, but it didn't help. Then, one evening, I came in for my usual workout, and Matt was waiting for me by the door. It was late, and the gym was almost empty. "Hey," he said, his voice almost too cheerful. "I was hoping we could talk. I know we've been training a lot, but I've been thinking we could maybe do something else together. I mean, you seem like the kind of person who'd want to take things to the next level, right?" His words made my heart race. I wanted to say something, to tell him to stop, but I didn't know how to respond. I froze. He saw my hesitation, and for a moment, I saw something in his eyes, a kind of desperation. It sent a chill down my spine. "I've been really focused on you," he said, stepping closer. "You're the kind of person who deserves someone who sees you for who you really are." I knew then I had to get out. I had no idea what he was talking about, but whatever it was not okay. I backed away and said, "Matt, I think we need to stop the sessions for a while. This is making me uncomfortable." His expression faltered, but he quickly recovered, forcing a smile. "Of course. I get it. No hard feelings." But his voice sounded off, like he wasn't really agreeing. He looked almost disappointed, but there was something else behind his eyes. It was like I had just done something to upset him. That night, I felt uneasy. I had a gut feeling I wasn't done with him yet. The next few days felt like a blur. I didn't respond to his texts, but they kept coming. "You're too beautiful to be alone. I think you and I could really be something. You don't understand. I can't stop thinking about you." I deleted every message as soon as I read it, but it didn't stop. It was like he couldn't take the hint. I started seeing him more often around the gym, even though I tried to avoid coming in when he was working. He'd find me. He'd always find me. It got worse when I started staying after hours to work out, trying to get away from the gym during busier times. One evening, I was finishing my set when I noticed he was sitting in a corner, watching me. His phone was in his hand, and he was staring at it like he was waiting for something. I couldn't take it anymore. I told the front desk staff that I wanted to cancel my membership. They were surprised, but they said they'd process it. I walked out of the gym with my heart pounding. But when I turned the corner outside, there he was. Matt, standing by his car, staring at me. His eyes were wide, and there was a strange smile on his face, like he'd been waiting for me. I felt sick to my stomach. I didn't stop to say anything. I didn't even make eye contact. I just ran, straight to my car. I drove home as fast as I could, trying to keep my hands from shaking. The whole time, I felt like he was following me. It wasn't rational. I knew it wasn't rational. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't done with him. That was 2 weeks ago. I haven't been back to the gym since. I blocked him on every platform, but sometimes I'll still get random numbers texting me, asking if I'm okay, telling me he misses me. I know it's him. I haven't told anyone about the messages or what happened, but I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. It's like he's always just around the corner. I live in a quiet little neighborhood. It's the kind of place where people keep to themselves, don't bother one another. I've always liked it that way. I work from home, so I don't see much of anyone most days. My house is a modest one, not too big, not too small, and I like it that way. It's on a street full of families and older couples, mostly quiet folks who've been living here for years. My neighbor, though, was different. Her name was Margaret. I'd see her sometimes, but never really interact with her. She kept to herself, never really left her house unless it was for groceries or some other errand. She was older, maybe in her late 60s or early 70s. I don't know exactly, but that was about the time I guessed. She didn't have a lot of visitors, and she didn't tend to socialize much with the other neighbors. At first, I didn't think much of it. Some people are just like that, right? Introverted. I didn't really notice anything strange about her behavior until a few months ago. I'm not sure what made me start noticing her more. Maybe it was the way she started looking at me when she saw me outside. At first, I thought it was just a glance, but it happened again and again. Every time I stepped outside, I'd catch her watching me from behind her curtain. She'd never wave or acknowledge me, just stand there, peeking through the blinds, her eyes never leaving me. The first couple of times, I told myself I was just being paranoid. Maybe she was just looking out the window at something else. But it started happening so often that I couldn't ignore it. One day, I went out to grab the mail, and I saw her standing in her front yard, just staring at me from across the street. I tried to make eye contact, to say something friendly, but she turned and quickly went back inside. It felt strange. Almost like she was deliberately avoiding me. Over the next couple of weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I tried not to let it get to me, but it was impossible not to notice. Her house was always dark except for one light in the upstairs window that seemed to stay on late into the night. But more than that, it was her presence always lurking in the background whenever I went outside. Sometimes, I'd feel like someone was watching me from behind her window or through her blinds. I'd look up and see the flicker of movement, but by the time I tried to see who it was, she'd already disappeared. It started to get to me. I found myself watching her house more and more. At first, I told myself I was just paranoid, but I started noticing little things. Small details that felt off. The same car parked outside her house at different times of day, but never moving. The way she always seemed to be home, even on days when there shouldn't have been any reason for her to be home. I started getting a strange feeling in my gut every time I walked past her house. The more I noticed, the more it felt like something wasn't right. It wasn't until one evening, when I went outside to take the trash out, that I finally noticed something that made my skin crawl. I was walking back toward my house when I heard a noise, a rustling sound, like someone moving in the bushes near her yard. I paused, my heart beating a little faster, and I glanced toward Margaret's house. I saw the flicker of movement behind a bush near the corner of her yard. I couldn't tell what it was, but it was enough to make me feel uncomfortable. I quickly went inside and locked the door. The next day, I was getting ready to head out for work, and I saw something else. I had left my car parked in the driveway, and when I went to get in, I noticed a small piece of paper wedged underneath the windshield wiper. It looked like a note. I wasn't sure why, but I felt an odd sense of dread as I pulled it off and unfolded it. There were no words, just a crude drawing of a house. My house. And at the bottom, a simple, jagged line cutting across the paper, almost like a symbol of something being watched. I felt a chill run down my spine as I stared at the paper in my hands. That night, I decided to take a closer look at Margaret's house. I wasn't sure what I expected to find, but my curiosity had gotten the better of me. I went out into my backyard, which bordered hers, and I tried to be as quiet as I could, moving along the edge of the fence. I kept my eyes on her house, trying to see if I could spot anything that seemed out of place. I didn't see her, but I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There was a camera. A small, black camera mounted on the corner of her house, pointed directly toward my backyard. I hadn't seen it before, and I hadn't heard any noise indicating she was installing it. The more I looked, the more I realized just how long it had probably been there, how long it had been watching me. I felt sick. The camera wasn't just some random thing, it was aimed directly at my house, my yard. Every time I stepped outside, I'd been under her watch. I felt like I had been living under a constant surveillance for months, and I had never known. It made my skin crawl. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to confront her, but I was terrified of what I might find out. I thought about going to the police, but what could I even say? A neighbor was watching me. I didn't have proof. I had nothing but a feeling, and I couldn't bring myself to take it any further without concrete evidence. But I couldn't just ignore it anymore. The next day, I went to a hardware store and bought a set of tools to cut down the camera. When I got back home, I waited until it was late. I wasn't sure if Margaret would be around, but I needed to take that camera down. It felt like the only thing I could do to regain some control over my own life. I carefully snuck into my backyard and moved along the edge of the fence again, staying as quiet as possible. I didn't know where she was, but I felt her eyes on me. My pulse raced. When I reached the spot, I took up the tools and cut the camera off the house. I didn't make a sound, but I could feel the weight of the moment, like something was about to happen. I was too scared to stay longer, so I quickly went back inside, closing the door behind me. The next morning, Margaret's house was dark again, like always. But something was different. I saw her standing in her window, staring out at my house. She didn't move, didn't wave, didn't do anything. She just stood there, her eyes fixed on me, watching. It was clear now. She had been watching me for months, and she wasn't going to stop. Whatever this was, it wasn't going to end on its own. I knew I had to leave, had to get out of that neighborhood, because I didn't know what she was capable of. But I also knew that if I didn't leave, I would always be looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next time I'd see her peeking out from behind her curtains. I don't know what happened to her after that. I left the neighborhood as soon as I could, but I still feel like she's out there, watching. It started small. At first, I didn't even notice. I live in a little apartment, just me and my cat, on the third floor of a building with thin walls and a lot of noise. You hear everything: arguments, kids running around, someone's music too loud at 2 a.m. It's annoying, but you get used to it after a while. There's a guy across the hall, middle-aged, thinning hair, always polite when we ran into each other. We'd say hi now and then in passing. He never seemed odd or anything. Just another neighbor. A few months ago, I started feeling watched. It's hard to explain because nothing was actually wrong at first. It's like that feeling when someone's staring at you in a crowded room, and you just know, even though you can't see them. It felt like that in my own apartment. Sometimes I'd glance out the window or check the peephole, but there was never anything there. Then little things started going missing. A pair of socks. A hairbrush. A necklace I liked. Stupid stuff, right? I thought I was just being forgetful. But one day, I noticed my toothbrush was wood even though I hadn't used it yet. That really freaked me out. I tried convincing myself I'd forgotten, but it stuck in my head. Around that time, the guy across the hall, Mark, he introduced himself once, started talking to me more. Always just when I'd leave for work or come back. He'd say things like, late night, or busy day at work. Stuff that didn't seem weird until I realized I hadn't told him anything about my job or schedule. I thought maybe he overheard me on the phone through the walls. It's not like I talk quietly. I stopped feeling comfortable at home. I'd keep my blinds closed all the time. I started locking my bedroom door when I slept. I even put a chair under the doorknob sometimes, which felt stupid, but it helped me relax enough to fall asleep. One night, around midnight, I heard a noise outside my door. It wasn't loud, but it was the kind of sound you notice when everything else is quiet. A faint scrape, like metal on metal. My heart was pounding so hard I couldn't think straight. I grabbed my phone and tiptoed to the peephole. There was no one there. The next day, Mark asked me if I'd been okay the night before. Said he thought he heard something outside my door. That's when I started putting things together. How would he know unless he was the one out there? I didn't say anything to him. I just nodded and went inside. I called my mom that evening, trying to calm down. She told me to install cameras, so I bought a couple cheap ones online and set them up in my living room and kitchen. I didn't think I'd catch anything. I just wanted peace of mind. The first night, nothing happened. The second night, though, the living room camera caught movement at 3:14 a.m. My heart dropped when I watched the footage. Someone was in my apartment. It was Mark. He had a key. I saw him walking like he belonged there. He didn't even hesitate. He went straight to the kitchen, opened the fridge, and drank from a bottle of orange juice I'd just bought. Then he wandered into the living room and stared at my couch for a while, like he was thinking about something. After a few minutes, he left. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I went straight to the building manager. I showed him the footage and demanded to know why Mark had a key to my place. The manager looked embarrassed and said Mark used to be the maintenance guy years ago. He must have kept the keys. They changed the locks immediately. I thought that was the end of it, but it wasn't. That same evening, I came home to find my door unlocked. The new lock. I was terrified, but I forced myself to go inside. Everything looked normal until I checked my bedroom. My closet door was open, and I always keep it shut. Inside, I found a small camera hidden on a shelf, pointing at my bed. I couldn't breathe. My hands were shaking so bad I dropped the camera. I called the police right away. They came and took a report, but they said without proof Mark put the camera there, they couldn't do much. I showed them the footage of him entering my apartment, but they said it wasn't enough to prove intent. I felt sick. That night, I packed a bag and went to stay at a friend's place. I didn't care about anything else in my apartment. I just needed to get out. The next morning, my friend convinced me to check the footage from my cameras again, just in case. I found more clips. Mark had been in my apartment multiple times. The footage showed him moving things around, my hairbrush, my toothbrush, even my clothes. He'd sit on my couch and look around like he was imagining living there. The worst clip was from the night before I left. He'd been in my bedroom, standing over my bed while I slept. I don't know how long he was there, but at one point, he reached out like he was going to touch my face and then stopped. I showed the police everything, and that finally got them to act. They arrested Mark the next day. They found more cameras and a notebook in his apartment with detailed notes about me, what I wore, when I left, what I did at home. He'd been watching me for months, planning something. They wouldn't tell me what. I moved out of that building the same week. I still feel like someone's watching me sometimes, but at least I know I'm safe now. Mark's in jail. I don't know for how long, but I hope it's enough. I don't think I'll ever feel completely okay again, but at least I got out. That night was colder than usual for that time of year. I remember because my breath fogged up the air when I loaded the last bag into the trunk of my car. I was parked in the far corner of the lot, the only space left when I arrived earlier. The shopping center had emptied out as the stores closed, and now the parking lot was nearly deserted except for a few scattered cars under dim yellow lights. It felt open and exposed, like being on a stage with no audience. I had just shut the trunk when I noticed him. He was standing about 2 cars away, leaning against the passenger side of a beat-up sedan. I didn't see him there before, and I'd been back and forth to the car a few times already. He wasn't doing anything at first, just standing there, arms crossed, staring in my direction. I avoided looking directly at him. Maybe he was waiting for someone, I thought. I opened the driver's side door, trying not to look like I was rushing, but my hands fumbled with the keys. I dropped them, and the sound of them hitting the ground felt too loud in the stillness. When I bent to pick them up, I glanced in his direction again. He had moved closer. He wasn't leaning anymore. He was standing straight, hands in his pockets, still staring. The hairs on my neck stood up, and I climbed into the car as quickly as I could, locking the doors the moment I was inside. I sat there for a second, pretending to check my phone, hoping he'd move on. He didn't. He stood there, not directly in front of my car, but close enough that I couldn't ignore him. I started the engine, the sound breaking the silence. He still didn't move. I glanced in the rearview mirror, then over my shoulder as I backed out of the space, careful to keep my distance from where he stood. As I turned toward the exit, I saw him out of the corner of my eye, walking briskly toward the car he'd been leaning on. It wasn't until I was out on the main road that I let myself relax a little. I figured he was probably leaving too, and it was just bad timing. I told myself not to overthink it, but I kept checking the rearview mirror. The headlights of a car appeared a few seconds later, pulling out of the lot behind me. At first, it didn't seem unusual. It was a busy area, and people were always coming and going, even late at night. But when I made my first turn, the car followed. I turned again, onto a quieter residential street, and so did they. It wasn't just the same direction, it was the same exact moves, every turn I made. The thoughts settled in my stomach like a stone. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it could still be a coincidence. I kept driving, taking another turn, then another, until I was looping through streets I didn't normally use. The car stayed with me, always at the same distance. When I reached a four-way stop, I decided to test it. I signaled right but turned left at the last second. The car hesitated, then turned left too. My chest tightened, and my hands gripped the steering wheel so hard they hurt. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't go home, not with him following me. I didn't want him to know where I lived. I thought about calling someone, but who? The police? I didn't even have proof yet, just a sinking feeling that this wasn't normal. I drove toward the main road again, hoping the traffic and lights would give me some kind of advantage. The car stayed close, its headlights bright in my mirror. I started weaving through lanes, taking random turns, anything to shake them off. It didn't work. Then I noticed something. The car wasn't just following, it was closing the distance. When I slowed down, they slowed down. When I sped up, they sped up too. It felt deliberate, like they wanted me to know they were there. I turned onto a long stretch of road with no streetlights, just empty fields on either side. My heart was pounding now, and my breathing felt shallow. I pressed harder on the gas, hoping I could put some space between us. The car behind me did the same. Suddenly, their headlights started flashing, on and off, like they were signaling me. It made my stomach churn. I didn't know what they wanted, but it felt like a game to them. They swerved slightly, their car edging closer to mine, and I realized they weren't trying to follow, they were trying to scare me. I spotted a gas station up ahead, its bright lights like a beacon in the darkness. I didn't think twice. I turned sharply into the lot, my tires screeching against the pavement. I pulled right up to the front, where the lights were brightest and a security camera was mounted on the building. The car didn't follow me in. It slowed down just enough for me to see it clearly, a dark sedan, windows tinted so I couldn't make out the driver. It lingered at the entrance for a moment, then sped off into the night. I sat there in my car, shaking, trying to catch my breath. I didn't get out right away. I kept my eyes on the road, half expecting the car to circle back, but it didn't. Eventually, I went inside the gas station, the bright fluorescent lights feeling like a shield. I told the clerk what had happened, and he let me stay there while I called someone to come pick me up. I left my car in the lot that night. It was safer there than anywhere else. I never found out who was in that car or what they wanted. The thought still creeps into my mind sometimes, especially when I'm out late. I don't park in empty lots anymore, and I always check my mirrors when I drive. You never know who might be watching. It had been a long day. The library was quieter than usual, as most people had left by the time I began my closing routine. I'm the only one who works the late shift. The library was small, so it didn't require much to close it up. Just a few last-minute tidying, a quick sweep of the aisles to make sure no one was lingering, and I could lock up and head home. I usually did everything in a set order. First, I turned off the computers, then I straightened up the front desk, and finally, I walked through the aisles to make sure no one was still hiding out in the back. I was almost finished, ready to turn off the lights and lock the doors, when I noticed him. He was standing near the history section, just a little too still. It wasn't the first time I'd seen someone lingering after hours. People sometimes get caught up in books and lose track of time. But there was something about him that felt different. I wasn't far away when I first noticed him, maybe 20 feet or so, and when he saw me looking, he didn't move. He just stood there, staring at the shelves like he was deep in thought. For a moment, I thought about ignoring it. But then I realized it was well past closing time, and we had to lock up. I walked toward him, trying to look as professional as possible, though I was starting to feel a little uneasy. "Excuse me, sir," I said as I got closer, my voice calm but firm. "The library's closing now. You'll need to finish up and head out." He turned slowly to face me. He wasn't very tall, but his presence made him seem bigger. He had a thick jacket on, even though it wasn't that cold outside, and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. His eyes were hard to make out, but I could see his jaw tightening. He didn't say anything right away. "I'm just looking for a book," he finally said, his voice low and almost hushed. I glanced around, trying to figure out what he was talking about. The history section was pretty well stocked, but it wasn't that big, and I couldn't see what he could be looking for. We didn't get many people coming in at this hour, so it struck me as odd that he'd still be looking for a book when it was clearly time to leave. I nodded slowly. "All right, well, I need to get the place locked up. If you want to find it quickly, I can help you. Just let me know what you're looking for." He didn't respond right away. Instead, he took a step back, looking past me, almost like he was weighing whether or not he wanted to leave. I noticed the way he stood, a little too rigid, like he was keeping himself from moving too much. He was either trying to seem casual, or he was waiting for something. "I just need a minute," he said, his voice colder this time. I didn't like the tone. My gut was telling me to be careful. It was rare for someone to act like this, especially when they knew the library was about to close. The hairs on the back of my neck started to prickle, and I took a mental step back, considering my options. "Look," I said, taking a small step back myself. "I'm going to have to call security if you're not leaving. We're closing, and you can't be here after hours." At that, he looked up at me for the first time, his eyes narrowing slightly. I could see his face better now. He had a scruffy beard and his features were sharp, his cheekbones high. He looked older than I had first assumed, maybe in his 40s, though he looked worn out, like he hadn't slept in days. The expression on his face was unreadable, like he was debating something in his mind. Before I could move toward the desk to pick up the phone, he stepped closer to me, blocking my path. I froze. He was too close now. "Please," he said, and there was a slight edge to his voice, something darker than before. "Just let me stay. I won't be any trouble." His voice dropped even lower, almost as if he was trying to convince himself as much as me. But his body was tense, like he was preparing to do something, and I knew it wasn't just about a book anymore. My mind raced, and I took a slow, deliberate step back, keeping my eyes on him. I had to keep it together. There was no way I was going to let him trap me in the back of the library. "I need to call security now," I said again, but this time my voice wavered just a bit. I reached for the phone, but he stepped forward and grabbed my arm, pulling it back just slightly. Not hard enough to hurt, but enough to stop me from getting away. I looked up at him, and I could see it now, the desperation in his eyes. It wasn't just about a book. It wasn't about anything that made sense. Something in him had snapped, or maybe it was always there. "You don't understand," he whispered, his grip tightening just enough to make me uneasy. "I just need to finish what I started." I had no idea what he meant by that, but I didn't have time to figure it out. My pulse was racing, and I could feel panic starting to rise. He was getting closer, his breath now out on my face. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I knew I had to get away, but I couldn't just push him. He was too close. If I made a move, I wasn't sure what he'd do. But I wasn't about to wait around to find out. My eyes darted to the door, and I realized there was a staff exit near the back of the library, not far from where we were standing. It was usually locked, but the emergency key was in my pocket. If I could just make a break for it. Before I could act, he stepped back, breaking the tension for a moment. It was just long enough for me to feel a small rush of relief. But then he did something that made my stomach drop. He pulled out a small object from his jacket pocket. I couldn't tell exactly what it was, but it was metallic, and my first thought was that it might be a knife. I don't know why, but in that instant, my body went into autopilot. I grabbed my phone out of my pocket with trembling hands, hit the emergency button, and shoved the phone into my pocket as I bolted for the staff door. I could hear him behind me, shouting something, but I didn't turn around. I didn't stop. I got to the door, fumbled with the keys, and forced it open. I slammed it behind me and ran down the hall to the back exit. I didn't look back once. I could still hear his voice, but I didn't dare slow down. When I got outside, I was out of breath, my heart pounding in my chest, but I didn't stop. I ran around the back of the building and out to the parking lot, where I saw a security guard approaching. I didn't know if the man followed me out, but I wasn't waiting around to find out. I ran straight to the guard, gasping for air, and told him everything. He immediately called for backup, and they swept the library, but by the time they arrived, the man was gone. There was no sign of him anywhere. Afterward, I sat in my car, my hands still shaking. I knew I wasn't going to work another late shift again anytime soon. I haven't been back since, not after everything that happened. It was supposed to be a quick ski trip, something to clear my head. The slopes were crowded that weekend, more than I liked, so I decided to take a detour off the main trails. It wasn't anything reckless. I'd done this kind of thing before and knew the area well enough to navigate back without much trouble. The snow was untouched and crisp, and for a while, it felt perfect. Just the sound of my skis cutting through the powder and the occasional gust of wind. I was about an hour in when I saw the campsite. It was tucked into a small clearing surrounded by trees, and the first thing I noticed was the tent. It was old and sagging under the weight of the snow, like it hadn't been touched in weeks. A fire pit sat in front of it, blackened but cold. There were no tracks, no skis or snowshoes, nothing that suggested someone was staying there recently. The whole scene felt wrong, out of place. This wasn't a popular area, and the weather had been bad for days. As I stood there, trying to decide if I should move on, I heard a voice behind me. "Hey! You lost?" I turned, startled. A man was standing just a few yards away, holding a pair of ski poles. He wasn't dressed like most skiers I'd seen, no bright jackets or sleek gear. He wore a thick, patched coat, heavy snow pants, and a wool hat that looked soaked from the snow. His face was pale, his cheeks red from the cold. His eyes were sharp, almost too sharp, like he'd been watching me for longer than I realized. "No, I'm fine," I said. "Just passing through." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Not many people come this way. Dangerous, you know. Easy to get turned around." "I'm not far from the trail," I said, though now I wasn't so sure. The trees all looked the same in every direction. "You should stay," he said. "The weather's turning. Safer to stick together." I glanced at the sky. It was gray and heavy, but nothing suggested a storm was coming. Even so, there was something about the way he said it that made me uneasy, like it wasn't really a suggestion. "I appreciate it, but I'm heading back soon," I said. He didn't respond right away, just kept staring at me. Then, without another word, he walked past me toward the campsite. He crouched by the fire pit and started poking at it with a stick, like he was trying to get a fire going. I stood there, unsure of what to do. The clearing suddenly felt smaller, like the trees were pressing in. "You don't have to be stubborn about it," he said, not looking up. "I've got plenty of room. It's not smart to be out here alone." "I'm fine," I said again, trying to keep my voice steady. I turned my skis slightly, ready to leave, but then he stood up. "You're not fine," he said, louder this time. "You think you know this place? You don't. You'll get yourself killed." His tone had shifted, sharper, almost angry. My heart was racing now, and I felt trapped. The snow was deep, the trees thick, and this man, there was something off about him. He took a step toward me, his boots crunching loudly in the snow. "Look," I said, raising my hands. "I didn't mean to bother you. I'm just going to head back." "Bother me?" he said, laughing, but it didn't sound natural. "You can't leave now. Not in this weather. You'll freeze out there." I glanced behind me, trying to gauge the best direction to go. My tracks were still visible, leading back to where I'd come from, but the snow was falling lightly now, and I knew they wouldn't last long. "You're staying," he said firmly. "For safety." That was it. Something in his voice flipped a switch in me. I pushed off hard with my poles, turning sharply and heading back the way I came. My skis cut through the snow, and for a moment I thought I was clear. But then I heard him behind me, shouting, "Hey! Stop!" I didn't stop. I didn't even look back. The terrain was uneven, and my skis wobbled as I dodged trees and small dips in the ground. My breath was loud in my ears, my chest burning with effort. I could hear him crashing through the snow, his boots slower but heavy. He was following me. The forest felt endless. I kept looking for landmarks, something familiar to guide me back to the trail, but everything looked the same. I was panicking, and I knew it. The snow was picking up now, thicker, and the light was fading fast. At some point, the sounds behind me faded. I slowed down, listening, but all I could hear was the wind and my own breathing. My legs were shaking, my hands numb even inside my gloves. I stopped, leaning against a tree, and scanned the area. Nothing. No movement, no sign of him. I waited, unsure of what to do. My tracks were faint now, barely visible under the fresh layer of snow. If I didn't find the main trail soon, I'd be stuck out here, and the temperature was already dropping. Then I saw him. He was standing a few dozen yards away, partially hidden behind a tree. He wasn't moving, just watching me. I don't know how long he'd been there, but the sight of him sent a jolt through me. I pushed off again, my skis clumsy as I tried to pick up speed. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees tighter, the snow deeper. I couldn't hear him anymore, but I didn't dare stop. When I finally saw the trailhead marker, it felt like a miracle. I stumbled onto the main path, my skis catching on the edge of the packed snow. There were people here, other skiers moving in groups, talking and laughing. I must have looked insane, barreling down the trail, breathing hard, my face pale. I didn't stop until I reached the lodge. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get my boots off. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I didn't know how to explain it without sounding crazy. The next day, I reported the campsite to the park staff. They said they'd send someone to check it out, but I never heard anything more about it. I don't know who that man was or what he wanted, but I can still hear his voice sometimes, the way he said, "You're staying." I haven't gone skiing since. When I first moved into the house, it was quiet. That's what I liked about it, the quiet. I'd been in the city for years, and I wanted something different, somewhere out of the way. The house was old, but it had a big yard and a good amount of space. The realtor had warned me that old houses had quirks, and I figured I could handle a creaky floor or drafty windows. The noises started maybe 2 weeks after I moved in. It was subtle at first, like a faint scratching sound in the walls. I assumed it was mice. The house sat on a lot of land surrounded by trees, so it made sense. I set a few traps and forgot about it. But the scratching didn't stop. If anything, it got worse. At night, I'd lie in bed and hear it moving, faint but deliberate, almost like something or someone was crawling through the walls. I told myself it was my imagination. It had to be. I worked long hours, and I was tired. But one night, I heard something different. It wasn't scratching this time. It was more like a thud. A single, heavy thud that came from somewhere below me. I shot up in bed and listened, heart pounding. Nothing. Just silence. The next morning, I went down to the basement to check things out. The basement was unfinished, mostly dirt and old stone walls. It always felt damp, and I didn't like going down there, but I figured if there was some kind of animal problem, I needed to deal with it. I didn't find anything, no droppings, no holes, nothing that pointed to mice or anything else. But that night, the noises came back. This time, it wasn't just scratching or thuds. It was movement. Shuffling, like something or someone was dragging themselves through the walls. It sounded like it was coming from the far end of the house, near the basement. I sat up in bed, listening, trying to convince myself it was just the house settling. But it didn't stop. It kept going, slow and steady, like it was getting closer. I grabbed a flashlight and went down to the basement again. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the light steady. The air felt colder than usual, and the damp smell was stronger. I swept the flashlight across the walls, looking for anything out of place. Then I saw a patch of dirt near the back wall that looked like it had been disturbed. The rest of the floor was packed hard, but this spot was loose, like someone had been digging. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to start digging up my basement in the middle of the night, so I went back upstairs and tried to sleep. I couldn't, of course. Every little noise made me jump, and I spent the whole night staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sounds to start again. The next day, I went back down to the basement with a shovel. I started digging where the dirt was loose, and it didn't take long to hit something, a piece of wood, rotted and soft. I dug around it and realized it was a hatch. It had rusted hinges and a metal ring for a handle. I stared at it for a long time, trying to decide if I should open it. I told myself it was just an old root cellar or something, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I pried the hatch open, and a cold draft hit me in the face. Below was a tunnel, just big enough for someone to crawl through. The walls were made of packed dirt, and it stretched off into the darkness. My flashlight barely penetrated the gloom, but I could see faint marks on the walls, scratches, like something had been clawing its way through. I wanted to close the hatch and forget I'd ever found it, but I couldn't. I had to know what was down there. I grabbed a heavier flashlight and climbed down into the tunnel. It was tight, and the air smelled damp and rotten. I moved slowly, keeping the beam of light ahead of me. The tunnel twisted and turned, and I realized it wasn't just one tunnel, it was a network, Whoever had dug it knew what they were doing. Then I found something that made my blood run cold. In one of the side tunnels, there was a pile of old, dirty blankets. Next to it was a plastic bag filled with empty food wrappers and cans. Someone had been living down here. My mind raced. Who were they? How long had they been here? And why? I backed out of the tunnel as fast as I could and slammed the hatch shut. I called the police, and when they came, I showed them what I'd found. They searched the tunnels but didn't find anyone. The blankets and food wrappers were still there, but whoever had been living down there was gone. They said they'd keep an eye on the property, but I could tell they didn't think it was a big deal. Probably just a homeless person, they said. But the noises didn't stop. That night, I heard them again, louder this time. It wasn't just scratching or shuffling. It was banging, like someone was trying to get out. I grabbed a chair and wedged it under the basement door. I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, I went down to the basement to check the hatch. It was open. I swear I had closed it and locked it, but now it was open, and the dirt around it looked freshly disturbed. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. I called the police again, and this time they took it more seriously. They searched the tunnels again, and this time they found something, a set of footprints leading away from the house. They said whoever it was had probably left, but I didn't feel safe. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that hatch, and I imagined someone crawling up through it, into my house. I packed up my things and left that same day. I didn't even bother selling the house. I just left. I don't know who was living in those tunnels or what they wanted, and I don't care. All I know is that I'm never living in a house with a basement again. It was late, almost midnight, when I finally locked the doors. The rain had started earlier in the evening, and by the time the last customers were gone, it was coming down in thick sheets. The diner was silent except for the steady patter against the windows and the hum of the overhead lights. I'd finished wiping down the counters and was about to turn off the neon open sign when I saw him. He was standing outside, soaked to the bone, his dark coat clinging to him like a second skin. His hair was plastered to his forehead, and the rain streamed down his face. He didn't knock, didn't gesture, just stood there, staring at me through the glass. I hesitated. The diner was in the middle of nowhere, just off the highway, and I was the only one here. It wasn't unusual to get late-night stragglers, but something about him made me uneasy. Still, it was cold, and he looked miserable. I opened the door a crack, careful to keep the chain on. "We're closed," I said. "Please," he said, his voice low but steady. "I need to come inside." I glanced out at the parking lot. His car wasn't there, just mine, sitting under the lone streetlight. "The storm's bad," he added. "I won't stay long." Against my better judgment, I unlatched the chain and stepped back. He stepped inside without thanking me, dripping water onto the linoleum. Up close, he looked worse. His cheeks were hollow, and his eyes were sharp and glassy, darting around the room like he was scanning it for something. I started to ask if he wanted coffee, but he interrupted me. "Do you work here alone?" His tone was flat, but there was something unsettling about the way he asked, like it wasn't really a question. Yeah," I said, gripping the edge of the counter. "But we're closed, so." "Must be quiet out here at night," he said, cutting me off again. "Just you and the highway." "Look, if you need to wait out the storm, fine," I said, trying to sound firm. "But I'm closing up." He didn't respond. Instead, he walked to one of the booths and sat down, water pooling under him. His head turned slowly, taking in the room. It felt like he wasn't looking at the diner but searching for something specific. Or someone. I stayed behind the counter, my heart pounding. "You've worked here long?" he asked after a minute, his voice breaking the silence. "Couple of years," I said. "Why?" He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "You like it?" "It's a job." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Do they know about you?" he asked. My stomach tightened. "What are you talking about?" "Your boss. Your customers. Do they know what you've done?" The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "I think you've got the wrong person," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He shook his head slowly, like he didn't believe me. "No," he said. "I don't." I wanted to tell him to leave, but the words caught in my throat. He wasn't shouting, wasn't threatening me, but there was something about the way he spoke that made me feel trapped, like he'd already decided how this night was going to go. "I don't know you," I said finally. "You need to leave." He leaned back, folding his arms across his chest. "You don't remember me?" "No," I said. "I don't." His smile faded. For a moment, he just stared at me, his eyes unblinking. Then he reached into his coat pocket. My hand shot to the phone on the counter, ready to call 911, but he didn't pull out a weapon. Instead, he placed something small and metallic on the table, a key. "You drop this," he said. I frowned. "That's not mine." "Isn't it?" he asked, tilting his head. "You sure?" "I've never seen it before." He pushed it toward the edge of the table, his fingers lingering on it. "You'd say that, wouldn't you?" I took a step back, my heart racing. "Look, I don't know what your problem is, but..." "My problem?" he snapped, his voice rising for the first time. "My problem is people like you. People who think they can do whatever they want and get away with it." I froze. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do," he said, standing up. The movement was sudden, jerky, like he was barely holding himself together. "You think I didn't see you? You think I don't know?" My mouth was dry. "See me do what?" He didn't answer. Instead, he started pacing, his wet shoes squeaking against the floor. "I've been watching you," he said. "I've seen how you look at people. How you smile at them, like nothing's wrong. Like you're normal." I grabbed the phone, my fingers trembling as I dialed. "I'm calling the police." "No, you're not," he said, his voice calm again. He stopped pacing and turned to face me. "Because they won't believe you." I hit call anyway, pressing the phone to my ear. It rang once, twice, and then the line went dead. I stared at the screen, my breath catching in my throat. No signal. There'd been signal earlier. I'd used my phone to check the weather. "I told you," he said. "They won't help you." I backed toward the door, my mind racing. "Get out," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. "Now." He didn't move. "You can run," he said. "But it won't change anything." I didn't wait to hear what else he had to say. I bolted for the door, fumbling with the lock. The rain hit me like a wall as I stumbled outside, the cold air stealing my breath. My car was only a few feet away, but it felt like miles. I dug into my pocket for the keys, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped them. Behind me, the door to the diner slammed open. I didn't look back. I threw myself into the driver's seat, locking the doors and starting the engine. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the parking lot. He was standing in the doorway, his face expressionless. I didn't wait. I hit the gas, skidding onto the highway. The rain made it hard to see, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get as far away as possible. My heart didn't stop racing until I saw the lights of a town up ahead. I never went back to that diner. The manager called the next day, asking why I'd left without locking up. I told him the truth, but he didn't believe me. Said the camera showed the place was empty when he arrived. Said there was no sign of anyone breaking in. But I know what happened. I know he was there. And I know he'll be back. I had parked my car in this small lot just off a wooded trailhead. It wasn't a big hiking spot or anything, just one of those places locals use to get some quiet. It was late, maybe around 9 at night, and I'd stayed out a bit longer than I'd planned. I was heading back to my car, the gravel crunching under my boots, when I saw a car sitting at the far end of the lot. The car's headlights were off, but the engine was idling. It wasn't there when I parked earlier. I could see two people inside, but it was dark enough that I couldn't make out their faces. Something about it felt off right away. There weren't many cars out here, especially this late, and the nearest main road was a good 5 minutes away. I told myself they were probably just waiting for someone. Maybe a couple who had gone for a walk. I tried not to overthink it, but my pace slowed as I got closer to my car. The other car was positioned so that it faced the trail entrance, and I had to pass it to get to mine. As I got closer, the driver's window rolled down a few inches. "Hey," the driver called out. His voice was calm, casual. I stopped, trying not to seem startled. "Yeah. You just come off the trail?" he asked. I nodded, glancing at my car, which was only a few steps away. "Yeah, just heading out now." The passenger leaned forward, and I could see him a little better. He was younger than the driver, maybe mid-20s, with a hoodie pulled up over his head. The driver looked older, maybe mid-30s, clean-shaven, with a baseball cap. "Not many people out here this late," the driver said, like he was making conversation. "Yeah, it's quiet," I replied, keeping my answer short. "You come out here often?" the passenger asked, tilting his head slightly. I shook my head. First time in a while. There was a pause, and I could feel both of them watching me. I stepped toward my car, reaching into my pocket for my keys. "You from around here?" the driver asked. His tone had shifted slightly, like he was sizing me up. "Not really," I said. "Just passing through." I reached my car and unlocked it, but before I could open the door, the passenger spoke again. "Where you headed?" he asked. That question froze me for a second. It was the way he said it, like he wasn't just curious, like he wanted to know something more specific. "Home," I said, keeping my voice steady. The driver chuckled softly, but there wasn't any humor in it. "Long drive?" I didn't answer right away. I was trying to figure out if they were just messing with me or if this was something more serious. I pulled open my car door and climbed in, locking the doors behind me. The driver leaned out of his window, his face still mostly in shadow. "We were just asking," he said. "No need to be rude." I didn't respond. I started the engine and glanced in my rearview mirror. The car behind me hadn't moved, but I could see their brake lights flicker on for a moment before going dark again. As I backed out of the parking spot, the driver's voice cut through the quiet. "Drive safe out there." It wasn't what he said, but the way he said it. Like it was a warning. I pulled out of the lot, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. I checked my mirrors as I turned onto the narrow road leading back to the main highway. At first, I didn't see their car, but then, about a minute later, their headlights came on. They followed me. At first, I tried to tell myself it was a coincidence. Maybe they were just leaving too. But they stayed close, too close, their headlights glaring in my rearview mirror. The road was winding, with no streetlights, and the darkness made it hard to see much else. I drove at a steady speed, trying not to let them know I was nervous. After a few minutes, I saw a turnoff up ahead, a dirt road that led to another trailhead. I decided to take it, hoping they'd keep going. I turned onto the dirt road, my tires kicking up gravel. For a second, I thought it worked. Their car didn't turn right away. But then, as I glanced in my mirror, I saw their headlights swing around the corner. I felt my chest tighten. This wasn't a coincidence. The dirt road was narrow, barely wide enough for two cars, and it wound deeper into the woods. I didn't know where it ended, but I didn't have much choice. I sped up slightly, hoping to put some distance between us. The other car sped up too. I reached a point where the road opened up into a small clearing. I slammed on the brakes, my car skidding slightly, and threw it into reverse. I spun the wheel and backed up, aiming to turn around and head back to the main road. The other car stopped at the edge of the clearing, blocking the way out. I sat there, my heart pounding. Their headlights were blinding, making it impossible to see who was inside. I could feel the panic rising in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. I shifted into drive and hit the gas, aiming for the narrow gap between their car and the edge of the clearing. My tires skidded on the loose gravel, but I managed to squeeze past them. As I sped back down the dirt road, I glanced in my mirror and saw their car turning around to follow me. I hit the main road and floored it, my car roaring as I pushed it as fast as it would go. The other car was right behind me, their headlights flashing now, like they were trying to mess with me. I knew I had to get to somewhere safe. The highway wasn't far, and I figured if I could make it there, I have a better chance of losing them. The next few minutes felt like hours. The road was dark and empty, and their car stayed right on my tail. I could see their silhouettes now, moving in the car, but I couldn't make out their faces. Finally, I saw the glow of the highway up ahead. I turned onto the ramp, my tires screeching as I merged onto the empty road. The other car followed, but they didn't stay long. After about a mile, they suddenly slowed down and turned off onto a side road. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, the adrenaline still coursing through me. I pulled into a gas station, parked under the bright lights, and sat there for a while, trying to calm down. I didn't see their car again that night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they'd been waiting for someone like me in that parking lot. I was out fishing alone that night. It was a spot I'd gone to a few times before, off a small creek that runs deep into the woods. The water there is smooth, quiet, and the fish are plenty if you know where to look. There was nothing around, just trees and the sound of the water moving. I liked that no people, no lights, just me in the dark and the feeling of being cut off from everything. It was peaceful. Around midnight, I'd settled into a good spot, pole set up, and was just sitting there waiting, not thinking about much, just watching the water ripple now and then. I'd started to doze off, half in and out, when I heard a branch snap behind me. I jerked my head up, startled, and there was this guy standing maybe 20 feet away. I hadn't heard him come up. He must have moved quietly because I'm usually good at picking up on sounds out there. He was holding a fishing rod, smiling at me. "Got any bites?" he asked. His voice was soft, almost casual, but something about it made my skin crawl. I nodded, trying to keep things normal. A few, I said, though I hadn't caught anything all night. I wasn't about to start a conversation. I just wanted him to move along. But he didn't. He just stood there, staring at me with that smile, his eyes half hidden under his cap. "Good spot you got here," he said after a while, stepping closer. I could feel myself tensing up, but I kept calm, pretending I was fine with him being there. I didn't like how he was watching me, though. It felt wrong, like he was sizing me up or something. I shrugged, looking away, hoping he'd get the hint and leave. But instead, he came closer, moving slow, taking his time. I could see he was a bit older, probably mid-50s, wiry but strong-looking, and his clothes were a little dirty, like he'd been out here a while. He finally sat down on a log across from me, facing me directly. "You come here a lot?" he asked, that smile fading a little. His tone was strange, almost accusing. "Once in a while," I mumbled, not wanting to say too much. He nodded, tapping his fishing rod on the ground. "Long enough to know the place well, then. Know which fish to go for when they're biting," he said, his gaze sharp, like he was expecting me to agree or admit something. I gave a short nod, staring down at the water, trying to pretend I wasn't bothered. But he didn't stop. "You usually bring that blue cooler with you?" he asked, pointing at the small cooler by my side. "I seen it before, you know." I felt my blood go cold at that. I looked up at him, trying to keep my expression blank. "Maybe," I said, keeping my voice even, though inside I was starting to panic a little. How would he know that? He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, watching me closely. "You sit on that same rock every time too." "Same one, right there, on that bank." I didn't answer. I just stared at him, my mind racing. I hadn't seen anyone else out here, not in all the times I'd been to this spot. It was quiet, private. That was the whole reason I came. But this guy, it was like he'd been keeping track, like he'd been out there watching me for who knows how long. "You're out here last Tuesday, weren't you?" he said, tilting his head, his smile fading into something darker. "And the Thursday before that?" My heart was pounding now. I hadn't told anyone I was out here on those days. It was my spot, my time to get away from everything. I looked around, the woods seeming a lot darker, a lot closer than they had before. "How do you know that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He shrugged, his eyes still on me. "Just happened to see you. Figured you'd notice, but I guess not." He grinned, like he'd told some joke only he understood. I didn't know what to say. I felt trapped. The guy wasn't just some stranger. He'd been watching me, following me, keeping track of when I came out here, what I brought with me. Every little detail. I wanted to stand up, walk away, but I was afraid he'd follow me, or worse. He kept going, talking about little things, bits and pieces that only someone who'd been watching me could know. He mentioned how I'd swatted at a mosquito the last time I was out, how I'd hummed a song while setting up my poles. Stuff that seemed meaningless, but now felt chilling. I hadn't even realized anyone was there. After a while, he stopped talking and just looked at me, that strange grin back on his face. "Feels strange, doesn't it?" he asked. "Knowing someone's been watching you all this time." I didn't answer, didn't move. I felt like a deer caught in headlights. I couldn't look away, couldn't leave, just sat there frozen, feeling more and more trapped. My mind was racing, trying to figure out a way to get out of there without causing a scene, without making him angry. Then he stood up slowly, stretching like he was getting ready to leave. I felt a surge of relief, thinking maybe he was finally done, finally going. But he didn't leave. He took a few steps toward me, real slow, his eyes never leaving mine. "I'm not the only one who's noticed you out here," he said, voice low. "You keep showing up, sitting in the same spot, doing the same things. People remember things like that." I wanted to ask him what he meant, but my throat felt tight. I could barely get a word out. He leaned in close, almost whispering, "Next time you're out here, you might find someone else sitting in that spot. You might not like who you meet." Then, just like that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the woods without another word. I sat there, my heart still pounding, staring after him, too stunned to move. I didn't know what to think, didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to pack up and run, but part of me felt like he was still out there, watching from the trees, waiting to see what I'd do. I stayed there a few more minutes, barely breathing, listening to every little sound around me, half expecting him to come back. But he didn't. It was like he just melted into the darkness, leaving me there alone. Eventually, I grabbed my gear and started back toward my car, keeping my head down, glancing around every few steps. The whole way back, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that he was still there, watching me from somewhere in the shadows. I haven't gone back to that spot since. Haven't gone out fishing alone at night at all. Every time I think about it, I remember his words, that look in his eyes. I'll never forget it. I was out in the woods later than I'd planned, but I tracked a buck that looked too good to pass up. The sun had already gone down, but the moon was enough to keep me from tripping over roots and branches, so I pressed on. There's a quiet out there in the woods at night, almost a kind of peace, and I was used to it. It's what I liked about hunting alone, actually. Just me in the night and whatever's out there. I was crouched near a tree, listening, trying to pick up any sounds. That's when I heard it, the faint sound of voices, not too far off. I figured it was some other hunters, though it seemed odd anyone would be out here this late. But I thought maybe they were camping, or maybe they'd had the same idea as me and stayed out past dark. I was going to ignore it and keep moving, but something about the tone of the voices caught my attention. They weren't talking normally. It sounded tense, almost like they were fighting. I got curious and decided to take a closer look. I knew these woods well enough to be quiet, to move without making much noise, so I crept over, getting close enough to hear what they were saying. There were two men. I couldn't see them yet, just hear them. One of them sounded angry, frustrated, and the other was talking low, trying to calm him down. "You didn't have to do that," the calmer one said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I told you, I didn't have a choice," the angry one shot back. "We wouldn't be in this mess if you just kept your mouth shut." I froze, every instinct telling me to get out of there, but something made me stay, crouched down behind a thick bush, listening. I didn't know what they were talking about, but it was clear it wasn't something I was meant to hear. "You think anyone saw?" the first guy asked, his voice low, but I could still hear the anger in it. "No one was there, all right? Let's just get it done. Then we can move on." The second guy sounded calmer, like he was trying to take control of the situation. There was silence for a moment, and then I heard a sound that made my blood go cold, the snap of a twig, way too close. My first thought was to run, but then I realized the sound hadn't come from me. It was the two men. They were moving. And they were coming closer. I tried to back up, moving slow, careful not to make any noise. But just as I took a step, my foot landed on a dead branch, and it cracked. It wasn't loud, but in the quiet of the woods, it sounded like a gunshot. There was a sudden silence from the two men, and then the angry one spoke up, louder this time. "Did you hear that?" I stopped breathing, hoping they'd brush it off, hoping they'd keep moving. But then the other guy said, "Someone's out here." Panic hit me like a punch to the gut. I was crouched down in the dark, trying to make myself as small as possible, but I could hear them moving now, their footsteps crunching through the leaves. They were getting closer, moving in my direction, and I knew they'd find me if I didn't do something. I thought about standing up, about making a run for it, but I didn't know how fast they were, didn't know if they'd have a gun. So I stayed put, trying to make myself blend in with the shadows, hoping they'd walk right past me. But they didn't. They stopped just a few feet from where I was hiding, close enough that I could hear their breathing. I could see their shapes in the dark now, just barely, two figures standing there, listening. "Who's there?" the angry one called out. He was trying to sound tough, but I could hear the fear in his voice. "Come out now, and we won't hurt you." I knew it was a lie. I could hear it in the way he said it, like he was trying to convince himself as much as he was trying to convince me. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just stayed still, hoping they'd get tired and leave. But then the other guy spoke up, his voice low and cold. "We know you're here. If you come out now, we won't have to make this worse for you." That was all I needed to hear. I knew they weren't going to leave until they found me, and if they found me, I had no idea what they'd do. I shifted, trying to inch away, but the angry one must have heard me. "There," he shouted, and before I knew it, he was charging toward me, crashing through the underbrush like he didn't care about making noise anymore. I bolted, taking off through the trees, my heart pounding so loud I could barely hear anything else. I didn't know where I was going, just knew I had to get away from them. I could hear their footsteps behind me, the angry one cursing, the other one telling him to keep quiet, but they didn't stop. I don't know how long I ran. My legs were burning, my lungs felt like they were on fire, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop, not with them right behind me, crashing through the trees, getting closer every second. Finally, I saw a break in the trees up ahead, a clearing, moonlight spilling over the grass. I knew it was risky, stepping out into the open, but I didn't have a choice. I sprinted toward it, hoping they'd lose me in the dark, hoping they'd give up. But as soon as I stepped into the clearing, I realized my mistake. There was no cover, nowhere to hide. I was out in the open, exposed, and I could hear them closing in behind me. I turned, saw their shapes emerging from the trees, and I knew I had seconds, maybe less. I spotted a fallen log near the edge of the clearing and threw myself behind it, pressing myself flat against the ground, trying to blend in with the shadows. They stumbled into the clearing a moment later, the angry one breathing hard, his eyes scanning the area. The other guy was quieter, his gaze sharp, like he was taking in every detail. "Where'd he go?" the angry one demanded, his voice panicked. "You said you saw him." "I did," the other one replied, his voice cold. "He's close. Just keep looking." They started moving around the clearing, their flashlights cutting through the dark, the beams sweeping over the grass, getting closer to where I was hiding. I held my breath, pressing myself as flat as I could, hoping they wouldn't see me. Then, the flashlight beam swept over the log, and for a second, I thought they'd missed me. But then the light swung back, and I knew they'd spotted me. "There," the angry one shouted, and he lunged toward me. I scrambled to my feet, stumbling as I tried to run, but he was faster, his hand grabbing my arm, yanking me back. I twisted, trying to break free, but his grip was like iron. "Let go!" I shouted, panic making my voice shake. The other guy stepped forward, his expression calm, almost bored. "We told you to come out," he said, his tone cold. "Now we have to make sure you don't talk." I didn't know what he meant by that, but I knew it wasn't good. I struggled, kicking and thrashing, and somehow managed to pull free, stumbling backward. The angry one lunged at me again, but I ducked, dodging him, and took off running, not looking back. I don't know how I made it out of those woods. I just ran, pushing through branches, tripping over roots, my lungs burning, my heart pounding. I didn't stop until I could see the lights of a road up ahead, until I knew I was far enough away that they couldn't catch me. When I finally made it back to my truck, I didn't waste a second. I jumped in, locked the doors, and drove, not stopping until I was miles away, safe. I don't know who they were, or what they were doing out there, but I know one thing: I'm never going back to those woods again. I was passing through this small town, somewhere out in the countryside, just trying to make it to my next destination before midnight. I'd been driving a long time, and my eyes were starting to feel heavy, so when I spotted the lights from an old-looking pub on the side of the road, I figured I'd stop in for a quick drink, maybe something to wake me up a bit. The place looked like it had been there for years, crumbling brick, a wooden sign that swayed with every gust of wind. The windows were fogged up, but there was a glow coming from inside. I could hear faint laughter and the hum of conversation, so it felt safe enough. Just a little, cozy spot tucked out of the way. I pushed the door open, and every sound stopped. It was like someone hit mute on a TV. Every single person in that place turned to look at me. I felt this weird jolt go through me, like I was some animal caught in headlights. But then, one by one, they all started smiling. It wasn't unfriendly, more like they knew me, or thought they did. The bartender, a tall, older guy with gray hair slicked back, waved me over like he'd been expecting me. I wanted to turn around and leave, but it felt rude somehow. So I nodded, a bit stiffly, and walked over to the bar. "Evening, stranger," he said, grinning wide, almost too wide. "We've been waiting for you." "Sorry, I think you might have me mixed up with someone else," I said, trying to laugh it off. "I'm just passing through." The bartender chuckled, shaking his head. "No mistake. You're right on time." It was unsettling, but I figured he was just being friendly, so I ordered a drink. As I waited, I noticed a few people were still looking at me from their tables. They all wore these little smiles, watching me with this strange intensity. I looked down at my glass and took a sip, trying to ignore them, but their eyes never left me. I felt trapped under all that attention. When I nearly finished my drink, I nodded to the bartender and tried to stand, but before I could, a hand landed on my shoulder. I glanced up, and there was this woman, older, maybe in her 50s, with this dark red lipstick that was just a little smudged. "Don't be in such a hurry, dear," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Stay a while." "Yeah," another voice chimed in. I looked over and saw a man a few stools down, smiling at me with these eyes that looked far too excited. "You just got here. No need to leave so soon." Something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. I shrugged their hands off, forcing a smile. I really should get going. I have a long drive ahead. The bartender set another drink in front of me, though I hadn't ordered it. "On the house," he said, giving me that same grin. "Just stay a bit longer." "No harm in that, is there?" I looked around the room. Every person was staring at me now. I tried to stand again, but the older woman leaned over and whispered, "We don't get visitors here often. Especially not ones like you." The way she said that last part made my stomach twist. "Ones like me?" I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. She nodded slowly. "Ones who fit." I didn't know what she meant, and I didn't want to know. I pulled out a few bills and set them on the bar, keeping my movements slow and calm. "Thanks for the drink, but I really have to go." The bartender's smile faded, just a little. His eyes narrowed, like he was calculating something. Leaving already? That's a shame. I backed toward the door, every instinct in me screaming that I needed to get out of there. Just as my hand reached the handle, the door swung shut, locking itself. My pulse spiked. What's going on? Just relax, the bartender said, his voice smooth and calm. No need to get worked up. You're safe here. The people around the tables began to stand up, slowly, almost in unison. They didn't say a word, just watched me, like they were waiting for something. I said I have to go, I managed, trying to keep my voice steady. A man near the door shook his head, smiling that same awful smile. You can't leave yet. We've been waiting a long time for you. That was when it hit me. They weren't joking. They were serious. Every one of them seemed to think I was meant to be here, like I'd been part of some plan they'd been hatching. The air felt thick, heavy, like it was pressing down on me, trapping me in that room. Look, I don't know what this is, but I'm leaving, I said, louder this time. My voice echoed in the quiet. The bartender sighed, almost like he was disappointed. It's not safe out there for someone like you, especially not tonight. The words were chilling, the way he said them. I felt a bead of sweat run down my neck. I'll take my chances. I tried to pull the door open again, but it wouldn't budge. Then I heard the lock click. I turned and saw the bartender holding a set of keys, twirling them around his finger with that smug look on his face. You're not going anywhere, he said. The people were getting closer now, moving in around me, blocking every possible way out. My mind raced, searching for some excuse, some way to get them to let me go. Please, I just stopped in for a drink. I didn't mean to intrude. Oh, you're not intruding, the older woman said, her voice almost sweet. This is exactly where you're supposed to be. I took a step back, feeling my heartbeat hammer in my ears. Why are you doing this? Like we said, the bartender replied, his smile never wavering. We've been waiting. I could feel the walls closing in, every face watching me with that unblinking stare, as if they'd already made up their minds about something. My pulse was racing, my breathing shallow. I didn't care if they thought I was crazy or rude anymore. I had to get out of there. I turned, pushing through the small crowd, shoving anyone in my way. I didn't care about the looks, the gasps, the disapproving whispers. I just needed to get to that door. I could hear them behind me, their footsteps closing in, but I pushed harder, slamming my shoulder into the door with all the strength I had. Somehow, it gave way, just enough for me to slip out. I stumbled into the night, nearly tripping over my own feet as I sprinted to my car. I didn't look back, I didn't want to see if they were following. I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to unlock the door. I threw myself inside and locked it, jamming the key into the ignition. As the engine roared to life, I finally looked up at the pub. They were all standing there in the doorway, watching me, those same blank, expectant smiles on every face. The bartender raised his hand, giving me this slow, almost friendly wave, like he was saying goodbye to an old friend. I hit the gas and tore out of that parking lot, my heart still pounding even as I got back on the highway. I didn't look back. I kept driving, even when the headlights of the pub faded in the distance. Every so often, though, I thought I could see that place out of the corner of my eye, still standing there, waiting. I don't know what they wanted from me, and I don't think I ever will. But I know one thing, I'll never stop at another small-town bar again. I had been working a stressful job for the last few months, so when I finally got a weekend off, I decided to get away for a bit. I booked a small, remote cabin in the woods, about 2 hours away from the city. The kind of place where there's no phone service, no internet, just peace and quiet. Perfect for getting my head straight. I got there late on a Friday evening, just as the sun was setting, and I could already feel the tension from work start to melt away. The cabin was rustic, a little older than I expected, but it was cozy. It had one of those old wood-burning stoves and a fireplace that crackled when I lit it. There was no one else around for miles, and I made a point not to mention this trip to anyone, not even on social media. I didn't want anyone to know where I was. I was just there to relax and clear my mind. The first few hours were calm. I unpacked, made a simple dinner, and sat by the fire. I didn't have any plans for the weekend, just wanted to enjoy the silence. I spent the night watching a movie on my laptop, the kind of thing you do when you're alone in a cabin, listening to the crackling of the fire and the occasional sound of wind moving through the trees outside. Around midnight, I decided to go to bed. The cabin was dark, but the moonlight outside provided enough light for me to make my way to the bedroom. I locked all the doors and windows, checked the stove to make sure it was off, and got into bed. The sheets were soft, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could actually get some sleep. I don't know exactly when I fell asleep, but I woke up suddenly, maybe around 2 a.m. I wasn't sure what had woken me, but there was a feeling in the air. Something wasn't right. I lay there, wide awake, listening to the silence of the cabin. For a moment, I thought maybe I had just been imagining things, but then I heard a faint sound. A soft shuffling noise, like something scraping against the wood floor. I sat up in bed, straining my ears, trying to figure out what it was. The house was completely still. No animals, no wind. It was dead quiet. But then I heard it again. The sound of something moving just outside my door. My heart started pounding in my chest. I didn't want to be paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was there. I told myself it was probably just the wind, or maybe an animal outside, but then the sound came again, this time, much closer, like something was right outside my door. I didn't move. I just lay there, listening. Then came a faint tap on the door. I froze. I didn't know what to do. I wasn't expecting anyone. No one knew I was here. The tap was soft, almost like someone was trying to be quiet, but I could still hear it clearly. I wasn't sure if I should check or not. Part of me thought I should just ignore it, that maybe I was just hearing things. But the other part of me, the part that was suddenly scared, wanted to know who it was. I got out of bed slowly, making sure not to make any noise. My feet hit the cold wood of the floor as I tiptoed toward the door. I didn't dare open it, but I stood close to the edge, trying to listen. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, and I held my breath. For what felt like forever, there was no sound. Then, out of nowhere, there was a soft slide under the door. I jumped back, almost falling over. My heart was racing now. Something had been slipped under the door. I didn't know what it was, but the thought of someone being out there, so close, sent a chill through me. I felt trapped, like I couldn't get away from whatever it was. I walked carefully to the door, my legs weak with nerves. I didn't want to open it, but I had to know. I bent down slowly, reaching for the paper that had been left there. When I looked at it, my stomach dropped. The letter was handwritten in neat, careful handwriting. It said, "I saw you take a walk this afternoon." The forest was quiet. Too quiet. I wonder what you did out there. My head spun. I hadn't seen anyone. I hadn't heard anything. The idea that someone was out there, watching me, made my skin crawl. I stood there for a moment, the letter in my hand, trying to think. It didn't make sense. How could someone know where I'd been? I had stayed on the path all day, far away from the cabin. I hadn't seen a soul. I hadn't even thought to lock the door when I went out. But there was no way someone had followed me that day, right? I started to panic. I looked around the room like I might spot something, someone, but there was nothing. Just a normal, empty cabin. I couldn't even bring myself to check outside. What if someone was watching me now? I locked the door again, double-checked the windows, and tried to go back to bed, but sleep was impossible. The feeling of being watched kept me awake, the letter burning in my mind. I kept imagining someone out there in the woods, hiding, just waiting for me to make a mistake. The next day, I spent most of the time inside the cabin, looking out the windows, paranoid. I didn't go outside much. I didn't want to risk being seen. The whole day felt off, like something was lingering in the air. It wasn't until I finally decided to leave that I realized the door had been unlocked. The handle had been moved, just enough for me to see it had been tampered with. But I was sure I'd locked it before I went out. That night, I didn't know what to expect. I was too scared to sleep, too scared to stay in the cabin. I waited for hours, my mind racing, and then, just as the night before, there was another tap on the door. Quiet. Deliberate. I didn't even bother checking the door this time. I just grabbed my things, and without a second thought, I ran. I didn't even know where I was going at first, but I just needed to get away. I didn't care if it was dark or if I had no plan. I had to leave the cabin. As I walked through the woods, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. I don't know why I didn't call the police. Maybe I was just too scared, or maybe it didn't feel real. But the farther I got from the cabin, the more I felt like I was finally free. When I finally reached the nearest road and found a car to get me back into town, I felt like I could breathe again. I didn't go back for my things, and I didn't think I ever would. I'm not sure who was watching me, or why they were doing it. But after that night, I never went back to that cabin. And I never will. I used to do my laundry at the 24-hour laundromat a couple blocks from my apartment. It was old, small, and pretty run down, but it was the only place close by that didn't charge a fortune. I always went late at night since I didn't like the crowds, and honestly, I thought it would be safer. I didn't expect anyone to be around at that hour, maybe just the occasional person passing through. That night was quiet. The only sounds were the low hum of the machines and the clinking of coins as I loaded them in. The fluorescent lights buzzed above, casting this dim, cold light across the whole place. I kept my head down, folding clothes while I waited for the dryer to finish. I didn't pay much attention to anything around me at first. Then I noticed him. I glanced up, and there he was, standing outside, just beyond the glass doors. He was just staring right through the glass, watching me like he was studying something. His eyes didn't move, his gaze was fixed straight on me, not looking at anything else. It was unsettling, but I tried to tell myself he was just waiting for someone or maybe taking a break if he worked nearby. I tried to ignore it. I went back to folding, keeping my head down, focusing on the shirts in front of me. But I could feel him watching. Every time I looked up, he hadn't moved. He was still there, just standing, with this strange blank look on his face. I tried to brush it off. Told myself it was nothing. A few minutes went by, and I thought he might have left, but then I looked up, and he was gone. I felt a wave of relief. Maybe I was just making a big deal out of nothing. I let myself relax, focusing on the warmth coming from the dryer as I took out my clothes. But then, just as I was about to finish, I heard the sound of the door creaking open. I looked up, and there he was, stepping inside the laundromat. He didn't say anything. He just stood near the door, looking around, almost like he was pretending to be interested in the machines. He didn't have any laundry with him, didn't look like he was here for that at all. I kept my head down, telling myself to just ignore him, that he'd leave once he saw I wasn't paying attention. But he started walking over, slow, taking these soft steps that barely made any noise. My heart was pounding, but I tried to act normal, pretending I was focused on my laundry. Then he stopped, just a few feet away from me, close enough that I could feel his presence. "You here alone?" he asked, his voice low, almost like a whisper. I didn't answer right away. I thought maybe if I ignored him, he'd get the hint. But he didn't move. He just stood there, waiting, his eyes fixed on me like he could see right through me. I finally forced myself to look up, trying to keep my voice steady as I replied, "I'm just finishing up." He nodded, but he didn't leave. Instead, he took a step closer, still staring. He looked so calm, almost like he was waiting for something, some signal to move. I felt this deep sense of unease settle in, like I needed to get out of there right then. I glanced at the clock, hoping it would be a decent time to call someone, but it was past midnight. No one would be awake. "You come here often?" he asked, his tone casual, like we were just two people chatting. I forced a nod, keeping my eyes on my laundry, folding each piece as quickly as I could. He moved closer again, stepping right into my space. I felt trapped, cornered between him and the row of washers. I could feel his eyes on me, every move I made, like he was studying me, waiting for a reaction. He didn't say anything after that. Just kept standing there, so close I could smell his stale breath, the faint smell of smoke clinging to him. I was just focused on my hands, trying to stay calm, telling myself he'd get bored and leave. But he didn't. "You know, I forgot something here last time," he said finally, breaking the silence. "Thought I'd come back and look for it." I just nodded again, not wanting to engage. I was scared. The way he was looking at me felt wrong, like he was enjoying how uncomfortable I was. I started to edge toward my laundry bag, hoping he wouldn't notice, that I could just grab my stuff and leave. But he noticed. He moved his arm, blocking my way, forcing me to look up at him. His eyes were dark, empty, almost like there was nothing behind them. "You in a hurry?" he asked, a slight smile forming on his face. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yeah, I've got to go." He just stood there, that creepy smile not moving. I started to feel my pulse quicken, the air around me suddenly feeling thick, like it was hard to breathe. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. I just needed to get past him, get to the door. I didn't care about leaving the laundry behind. I took a step back, and he took a step forward. My heart was pounding so loud, I could barely hear anything else. I felt my throat tighten. I took another step back, and he mirrored me, each of us moving in this strange, silent dance, like he was taunting me. Finally, I managed to break away, moving around him, keeping my eyes on the door. But just as I was about to reach it, he grabbed my arm. His grip was tight, almost painful. I looked up at him, my stomach twisting. "You're leaving already?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I tried to pull my arm free, but he held on. His hand was cold, and his grip was firm. I could feel the panic rising in me, my mind racing with all the worst-case scenarios. "I've got to go," I said, barely managing to get the words out. For a moment, he didn't move, didn't let go. He just looked at me, that same empty stare, like he was trying to decide something. I thought about screaming, but I didn't know if anyone would hear me. The laundromat was isolated, with no one around at this time of night. Then, finally, he released me. I stumbled back, grabbing my things as fast as I could, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold onto them. I didn't look back, didn't say anything else. I just bolted for the door, my heart racing as I stepped out into the cold night air. As I walked home, I felt his eyes on me, even though I didn't look back to check if he was watching. I just kept walking, my mind replaying everything that had just happened, my stomach twisting with fear. I didn't stop until I was safely inside my apartment, locking the door behind me, my hands still trembling. After that night, I couldn't go back to that laundromat. I started going to one across town, no matter how inconvenient it was. I didn't care. I never wanted to see that man again, never wanted to feel that kind of fear. Sometimes, late at night, I still feel like he's watching me. I was sitting there, waiting for the train in the cold, empty station. It was late, past midnight, and there wasn't another soul around except for this one guy across from me. I didn't pay him much attention at first. I was tired, nodding off a bit, just wanting the train to show up so I could get home. But I started to feel something, like someone's eyes on me. I looked up, and there he was, staring right at me. At first, I thought he was just some tired guy, zoning out, maybe looking in my direction by accident. I looked away, shifted in my seat, tried to ignore it. But every time I looked up, he was staring. Not moving, just looking at me. His eyes were wide, intense, and it felt like they were cutting right through me. He didn't blink. Didn't shift his weight. Just stared, like he knew me or something, like he was waiting for me to do something. I felt uneasy. It's hard to explain, but there was something wrong about his stare, like it was too focused, too personal. I decided to get up, put a little space between us. So, I walked over to a different bench, closer to where the train was supposed to come. I sat down, took out my phone, tried to look busy, but I could still feel it, that feeling of being watched. And sure enough, a few moments later, I see him out of the corner of my eye. He'd gotten up too. He walked over to my new bench, real slow, like he was taking his time, enjoying it or something. He sat down right next to me, not across, not a couple of seats away. Right next to me, close enough that I could feel him breathing, smell the faint scent of something stale on him, like old cigarettes and sweat. He didn't say anything at first, just sat there, looking forward. I could see him from the corner of my eye, that same intense, unblinking stare. Finally, he leaned over, real close to my ear, and he whispered, "Why did you move?" It sent a chill down my spine. His voice was raspy, quiet, like he didn't want anyone else to hear, even though it was just the two of us. I didn't know what to say, so I just mumbled something about wanting to be closer to the tracks. He smiled, a slow, strange smile that didn't reach his eyes, and then he said, "You shouldn't have moved." I felt my skin prickle, like he was trying to get a reaction out of me. I thought maybe he was drunk or just looking to mess with someone. I turned slightly, trying to look away, hoping he'd take the hint. But he didn't. He leaned closer, like he had something to share, like he knew a secret. He whispered again, barely a breath this time, "You shouldn't be out here alone." It was such a strange thing to say, and it felt like a threat, like he knew something I didn't. I didn't know how to respond, so I just muttered something about how I was fine, how the train was coming soon. I was trying to keep calm, but I could feel my pulse quickening. He didn't say anything else for a while, just kept sitting there, too close, too still. Then, out of nowhere, he started talking again, and this time he was talking about me. "You live over on Oak Street, don't you?" he said, like it was the most casual thing in the world. I froze. Oak Street was where I lived, but I'd never seen this guy before, never even talked to him. My mind raced, trying to figure out how he could know that. I managed to stammer, "How do you know where I live?" But he just laughed, this low, scratchy laugh that didn't sound right. He looked at me, that smile creeping back onto his face, and said, "I know more than that. I know you get home around this time most nights. I know you stop at that little coffee shop on the way. I know you don't like the dark." I felt my heart pound harder, my chest tightening. I didn't know how he knew these things. I hadn't seen him before, hadn't told anyone where I lived or what my routine was. It was like he'd been watching me, keeping track, but why? And for how long? I tried to get up, tried to put some distance between us, but he grabbed my wrist, tight, his fingers digging in like claws. I could feel the roughness of his skin, and his grip was stronger than I expected. "Where are you going?" he asked, his voice low, his eyes wide and unblinking, like he was enjoying the fear he could see in me. I need to get something from my bag," I lied, trying to stay calm. He didn't let go, not right away. He stared at me, searching my face, and then finally, he let go, but he didn't move. He just sat there, watching as I stood up, his head tilted slightly, like he was waiting for something. I backed away, slowly, keeping my eyes on him, and moved to another bench, further down the platform. But he didn't stay put for long. A minute later, he was on his feet, walking toward me, that slow, deliberate pace again. He didn't break eye contact, didn't blink. It was like he was trying to make me feel as uncomfortable as possible, like he was enjoying it. He sat down next to me again, close enough that our knees almost touched, and he leaned in, that grin back on his face. "I knew you'd move again," he whispered. "I knew you couldn't stay still." I didn't say anything. I was too scared. My mouth felt dry, and I could feel my hands shaking. I tried to look away, to pretend he wasn't there, but he reached out, grabbing my chin, turning my face toward him. His grip was firm, his fingers cold. He looked into my eyes, and there was something in his gaze, something dark, something wrong. "You know I could follow you," he said softly, his voice almost gentle, but his eyes were full of something sharp, something that felt like it was slicing into me. "I could follow you all the way home, and no one would know. No one would see." I felt a surge of panic. I yanked my face away, scrambling to my feet, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I didn't care about being polite anymore, didn't care if I looked crazy. I just wanted to get away from him. I backed up, moving toward the edge of the platform, closer to where the security cameras were, hoping they'd catch whatever was happening. He didn't follow me this time. He just sat there, smiling, watching me, his head tilted, his eyes never leaving me. I stayed near the cameras, my hands shaking, waiting for the train, praying it would come soon. He didn't move, didn't come any closer, but he kept watching, his smile never fading. Finally, I heard the rumble of the train in the distance. Relief washed over me, and I stepped closer to the edge, ready to get on, ready to put as much distance between me and this man as possible. But just as the train pulled up, he stood up, took a few steps toward me, and said one last thing. "I'll see you soon." The train doors opened, and I practically jumped inside, my heart racing. I didn't look back as the doors closed, didn't look to see if he was still standing there, watching. I just sat down, my hands still shaking, my mind racing. I didn't know who he was, didn't know how he knew so much about me, but I knew I never wanted to see him again. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been serious, that he'd find me again, somehow. I kept the lights on, kept the doors locked, and tried to tell myself it was over. But deep down, I knew he wasn't done with me. Not yet. The train station was almost empty. Snow was coming down hard, the kind of storm that makes it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. I had been waiting for hours already, hoping the delayed train would finally show up. The wind cut through every layer of clothing I had on, and even in the small waiting room, the cold seeped in through the walls. There were a few other people around, just enough to feel like I wasn't completely alone, but not enough to make it any less eerie. One woman with a suitcase sat in the corner, staring at her phone. A couple of guys were slouched on the benches near the door, talking quietly. And then there was the man on the far end of the platform. At first, I didn't think much about him. He was standing by himself, bundled up in a long coat and scarf, his hood pulled low over his face. He looked like anyone else waiting for the train, but something about the way he stood there bothered me. He wasn't pacing or checking his phone like everyone else. He was completely still, just standing there with his hands in his pockets. When I looked over at him again, I realized he was staring at me. I turned away quickly, pretending I hadn't noticed, but it unsettled me. I kept telling myself it was nothing. People stare sometimes without realizing it. Maybe he wasn't even looking at me. But every time I glanced back, his head was still turned in my direction. He didn't move, didn't shift his weight, didn't look away. After a while, I couldn't take it anymore and decided to go back inside the waiting room. It wasn't much warmer, but at least it felt less exposed. I found a seat where I could still see the platform through the window. The man was still out there, still staring. The snow was piling up around him, but he didn't seem to notice. Everyone else had either gone inside or left. I tried to distract myself by scrolling through my phone, but I kept glancing up at the window. He was still there. He hadn't moved an inch. Finally, the train pulled into the station. The sound of it was almost a relief, breaking the silence that had been pressing down on me all night. I grabbed my bag and joined the small group of passengers heading for the doors. When I stepped outside, the cold hit me like a wall, and I hurried to get on board. As I climbed the steps, I looked back over my shoulder. The man was walking toward the train now, his pace steady and deliberate. I didn't see him carry a bag or a ticket, but I told myself not to overthink it. Maybe he just didn't have much luggage. I found a seat near the middle of the car, next to a window. The train was quiet, with only a handful of people scattered throughout. I sat down, trying to shake off the unease that had been building all night. The man walked into the car a few moments later. He didn't sit down right away. Instead, he stood near the entrance, looking around like he was deciding where to go. Then he started walking down the aisle, his footsteps slow and heavy on the floor. He passed by several empty seats before stopping a few rows behind me. I couldn't see him without turning around, but I could feel his presence, the way you can tell when someone's watching you even if you can't see them. I tried to ignore it, staring out the window at the snow-covered landscape rushing by. The train moved steadily through the storm, the rhythmic sound of the wheels on the tracks almost soothing. But every so often, I caught a glimpse of his reflection in the glass. He was still sitting there, still watching. The ride felt endless. I kept telling myself that as long as I stayed in my seat and didn't react, everything would be fine. Maybe he wasn't even watching me. Maybe I was just being paranoid. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw him get up. He walked slowly down the aisle, his footsteps louder than they should have been in the quiet car. I tensed up, gripping the armrests of my seat, but he didn't stop. He walked right past me and into the next car. I let out a shaky breath, trying to convince myself that it was over. He was gone. but something told me not to relax just yet. I kept my bag close and stayed alert, watching the door to the next car. Minutes passed, and he didn't come back. I started to think maybe I had overreacted. When the train pulled into the next station, a few people got off. I thought about leaving too, but it was late, and I didn't want to get stranded in another unfamiliar place. I stayed in my seat, hoping the rest of the ride would be uneventful. But then I saw him again. He was standing on the platform, just outside the window. I don't know how he got off the train without me noticing, but there he was, staring up at me through the glass. His hood was still pulled low, and his face was shadowed, but I could see enough to know it was him. He didn't move, didn't try to get back on the train. He just stood there, watching as the doors closed and the train pulled away. I didn't see him again after that. The rest of the ride was quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, somewhere, watching. When I finally got to my stop, I practically ran off the train and into the station. It wasn't until I was in a cab, heading home, that I started to feel safe again. Even now, I can't explain what happened. I don't know who he was or what he wanted. But every time I think about that night, I can still feel his eyes on me, unblinking, in the middle of that snowstorm.